spent 8 months in visible quiet, careful, easy to overlook. Then a 200-pound combat veteran hit the floor, raised both hands like he was aiming a rifle at something no one else could see, and began screaming coordinates into the air. Froze. The facility director shouted for a sedative, and the small, soft-spoken nurse in blue scrubs stepped directly into the man's line of fire, lowered her voice to a frequency that cut through the noise like a blade, and spoke 3 words no civilian should have ever known. The room went completely silent. So did the veteran. Before this story goes any further, if you found this video and you are still here after that opening, you already know this one is different. Hit subscribe right now, because the stories on this channel do not let you go easy. Hit the like button so more people find this before it gets buried. And drop a comment telling me the city or country you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels before it is done. Now, let us go back to that room. Let us go back to the moment everything changed. The call had come in at 6:43 in the morning, which was how most things began at Hartwell Veterans Recovery Center, not with sirens or emergencies, but with a quiet administrative note slipped under a door or whispered across a nursing station. Room 14 was having a difficult night. That was the phrase the overnight aide had used. Difficult night. As if what was happening to Caleb Merritt in room 14 was a minor inconvenience, like a man who'd had too much coffee and couldn't sleep. Nora Vance had read the note at the start of her shift, tucked it into the pocket of her scrubs, and walked to the room without hurrying. Not because she didn't care, because she had learned, over 8 months at this particular facility, that running towards something in this building had a way of drawing the wrong kind of attention. Hartwell Veterans Recovery Center sat at the edge of Crane Falls, Montana, a town that was barely a town, more of a geographic designation, surrounded on 3 sides by federal forest, and on the 4th by a 2-lane highway that flooded every spring. The facility itself was a converted ski lodge from the 1980s, high ceilings and exposed timber beams that somebody had once thought would feel welcoming. It mostly just felt cold in January. The heating system was patchy. The cell signals was worse. And the man who ran the place, Director Harlan Colt, had the particular confidence of someone who had spent 20 years making decisions for people who couldn't push back. Nora had been hired as a contract nurse 8 months ago. She had come with a clean resume, solid references, and a very deliberate omission the decade before her nursing license, the years she had chosen not to explain. She wore no pins. She attended no Veterans Association events. Kept her scrubs pressed and her head down and her opinions to herself unless someone was about to make a clinical error that would hurt a patient. She had been wrong about a lot of things in her life. She had not been wrong about that approach. Room 14 was at the end of the East Corridor, past the physical therapy room with the broken resistance bands that had been on the replacement order for 6 weeks, past the common room where the television was permanently tuned to a sports channel nobody liked because nobody wanted to touch the remote, past the supply closet that Nora had reorganized 3 times because the IV bags kept getting stacked in front of the blood pressure cuffs. She pushed open the door and found 2 staff members pressed against the far wall. Caleb Merritt was on the floor. He was not seizing. He was not unconscious. He was crouched low in the corner between the bed and the window, both hands raised in a shooter's grip, fingers wrapped around nothing, his eyes fixed on the wall at a distance that was not in this room. He was wearing a gray hospital gown and 1 sock. His other foot was bare and pressing flat against the linoleum, like he was anchoring himself to a position. He was whispering something in a clipped, rhythmic cadence that Nora recognized before she had taken 3 steps into the room. Teams West, 12 o'clock, hold the line, hold the line. She stopped moving. She did not raise her voice. She looked at the 2 aides against the wall, Darren, who was 22 and had been working here 4 months, and Patricia, who was older and should have known better. And she made a short, flat gesture with 1 hand. Get out. They moved. The door swung behind them. Nora crouched. She did not crouch all the way, not to his level. Not yet, because that was a specific kind of communication, and she needed him to hear her first. She dropped her voice to a low, even register. Not soft. Soft was condescending. Low and even, like a radio frequency. Like something steady coming through static. Merritt? He didn't stop, but something shifted. A micro-adjustment. His shoulders changed by half an inch. Merritt, you're reading grid coordinates. I need you to pause. Contact west? I know, I'm reading it too. She let that land. Position's clear. You can hold. His hands lowered 2 inches. Just 2. But 2 was something. She watched his breathing, the compressed, shallow rhythm of someone running on adrenaline without an exit, and she matched her own breathing to a slower pattern, deliberately, the way a metronome can pull a musician back into tempo if you give it time. It wasn't a trick. It was just physics. Nervous systems were not immune to other nervous systems. You're not on the line, she said quietly. You're in Crane Falls. January. Room 14. Don't. His voice cracked on the word. Don't say that. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to listen. A beat passed. 2. The kind of silence that felt like a held breath. What's your call sign? He asked. And his voice, when he asked it, was different. It had dropped out of the combat register into something rougher and more uncertain. Axe? Something real. Nora looked at him for a long moment. She had told herself, 8 years ago, that she was done with that version of herself. That the woman who had carried that call sign across 2 deployments and a classified operation she still couldn't talk about had been left behind somewhere in the process of becoming a civilian. She had built an entire life around the premise that you could simply close a door on who you had been and walk away from it. Sparrow Two, she said. Caleb Merritt's hands came down. He sat back against the wall, knees up, breathing hard, eyes slowly focusing on the actual room around him. He looked at her like she was something he couldn't categorize. He stopped. Yeah, she said. I know. She gave him 30 seconds. Then she stood up, crossed to him carefully, and crouched beside him to check his pulse manually, because the room's monitoring equipment had been unplugged by someone who thought the beeping was disturbing other patients. His pulse was elevated but stabilizing. His pupils were reactive, tracking her face. Can you tell me what day it is? She asked. Thursday. He thought about it. Maybe Thursday. Close enough. She rocked back on her heels. Are you hurt? My shoulder. He shifted slightly. Hit the radiator when I went down. She checked it rotator cuff area, tender to palpation. No deformity. Bruising already developing beneath the skin. She was mid-assessment when the door opened. Harlan Colt was not a large man, but he had a way of entering rooms that made him feel larger than he was. He had gray hair cut close at the sides, a button-down shirt that was always tucked in, and the particular expression of someone who had learned to manage people by making them feel like they needed managing. He looked at Caleb on the floor. He looked at Nora crouched beside him. He looked at the 2 aides hovering in the corridor behind him. Why is no one on the call button, he said. His voice was precise and controlled. Why was I not notified directly? The patient was in a dissociative episode, Nora said. I handled it. You handled it. He said it the way people say things when they don't actually want an explanation. They want an opening, clearing the room of staff and crouching on the floor. By de-escalating a combat veteran experiencing a PTSD-related flashback without the use of sedatives, which is the medically appropriate response when the patient's airway is not compromised. And, you are a contract nurse, Colt said. You are not a therapist. You are not a physician. You cleared my staff from a room without authorization and made an unsupervised clinical decision about a high-risk patient. Nora stood up. She was not particularly tall, but she had the posture of someone who had been trained to take up exactly as much space as the situation required. No more, no less. With respect, the physician on rotation doesn't arrive until 9. 7:10. The patient needed someone. The patient needed the protocol. Colt's voice had gone colder. Requires staff present, documentation in real time, and notification up the chain before any intervention. Caleb's voice came up from the floor, rough and unimpressed. She was the one in the room. That's what I needed. Colt looked at him, then back at Nora. The look was a very specific kind, the kind that files something away for later. Document the incident, he said. Full report on my desk by 10. He glanced down at Caleb with something that was almost concern, but stopped just short of it. We'll get the on-call aide to sit with you until the physician arrives. He left. The door swung shut. Nora exhaled through her nose, very quietly. He's going to put that in your file, Caleb said. He already put something in my file, Nora said. Probably the first week. Caleb looked at her again with that same unclassifiable expression. Sparrow Two. Which unit? I can't talk about that. I know. He shifted his weight against the wall. I'm asking anyway. She looked at him for a moment. How's your shoulder? Hurts like hell. He paused. Thanks for not sedating me. Don't thank me. Just eat breakfast when they bring it. She stood up. And tell them the radiator in this room needs a cover. You're not the first person to hit it. She left the room before he could ask anything else. The report she wrote was accurate and thorough, and took 50 minutes. She submitted it at 8:58, 2 minutes before the deadline, and then she went to the break room and stood at the window looking at the mountains until her coffee went cold. Crane Falls in January was a particular kind of beautiful that she had learned not to trust. Everything looked still from a distance. That was usually when things were moving underground. She had come here because it was quiet, because it was far from anywhere that the word classified still meant something in day-to-day conversation. Because the job posting had described a low-conflict environment with predictable hours and patients who needed consistent, skilled care. She had read that posting 4 times before applying, and she had told herself it was exactly what she needed. Place to be useful without being known. That had lasted about 3 weeks. Then she had noticed the staffing ratios. Then the emergency kit in the main corridor that had expired medications, and a defibrillator whose battery had not been tested since the previous March. Then the pattern, the way Colt moved through the facility, with the ease of a man who had never once been held to account for anything, who smiled at board members, and spoke sharply to nurses, and treated the veterans in his care like a product he was responsible for maintaining to a minimum standard. She had submitted 3 internal memos. She had received 2 acknowledgments and 1 request to resubmit through the proper intake channel, which turned out to be a form that had to be printed and physically handed to the administrative coordinator, who was part-time and came in Tuesdays and Thursdays. She had resubmitted. She had heard nothing. The coffee was definitely cold now. She poured it down the sink. The rest of the morning moved the way mornings at Hartwell moved medication rounds, vitals, 2 physiotherapy escorts, a long conversation with a 70-year-old Marine named Dwight Foss, who wanted to tell her about a dog he'd had in 9,987, and then cried a little without acknowledging that he was crying, which she had learned to navigate by sitting very still and not making direct eye contact. She changed 2 wound dressings. She updated 4 charts. She submitted a requisition for fresh IV tubing that she expected to disappear into the same void as the resistance bands. At 2:15, Colt called her into his office. The office was on the 2nd floor, which had originally been the lodge's event space, and still had a bar counter along one wall that had been converted into filing cabinets. Colt sat behind his desk, with the posture of a man who had thought carefully about how his posture communicated authority. He gestured for her to sit. She sat. I've reviewed your incident report, he said, and the records from the morning. Okay, I want to be direct with you, Nora. He used her first name like a decision. Your approach with Mr. Merritt, while it had a positive immediate outcome, created a liability issue for this facility. Unsupervised intervention with a high-risk patient. He was not a liability. He was a person in crisis. That's a meaningful distinction in a clinical ethics seminar. In a facility that is subject to state review and insurance auditing, both things are simultaneously true. He folded his hands on the desk. I'm not dismissing what you did. I'm telling you that how you did it is a problem. I filed the documentation. I flagged every decision I made and why I made it. You flagged it after? He let that sit. Protocol requires notification before. I understand that in a real emergency, seconds count. But a dissociative episode, while serious, is a managed risk here. We have procedures. Your procedures require 2 aides to be present. One of your aides has had 3 weeks of training. The other panicked and pressed herself against the wall. If I had spent time escalating up the chain before intervening, Caleb Merritt would have had a significantly longer and more dangerous episode. Colt looked at her with the patient expression of someone who had decided the outcome of this conversation before it began. I've decided to add a formal note to your contract file regarding today's deviation from protocol. Nora kept her face still. Is that a disciplinary action? It's a note. If it happens again, it becomes something more formal. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. The defibrillator in the main corridor, she said. Battery hasn't been tested since last March. I flagged that in my second memo. We're working on replacement scheduling. The IV tubing requisition I submitted 5 weeks ago. Supply chain issues. We're managing it. And the staffing ratio on night shift, which is currently Nora. He said her name again. A door closing this time, not an opening. I appreciate your investment in this facility's operations. I'd encourage you to stay in your lane. She stood up. I appreciate the clarity, she said. She meant it in the way that conveyed the opposite. She walked back to her station, pulled out her shift notes, and wrote down the date and time of the meeting in her own handwriting. She had learned in a previous life that documentation was not a formality. It was armor. You built it before you needed it, because by the time you needed it, there was never enough time to build it properly. The storm warning came at 4 o'clock. Not a formal alert, Crane Falls didn't get those in any reliable way, but the maintenance supervisor, a laconic man named Roy Hebert, who had worked at the facility since it was still a lodge, knocked on the nursing station window and said, in the flat tone he used for everything from a broken faucet to a structural issue, mountain weather's moving fast. Roads'll ice by 6. Nora looked out the window. The sky to the northwest had gone a particular shade of gray-green that she recognized from her second winter in a region that had weather patterns like this. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that announced itself. She checked the emergency communications board, a laminated sheet on the wall behind the station that listed protocols, phone numbers, and equipment locations. Emergency satellite phone, supply room, shelf 4B. She had verified its location her second week. She pulled the board off the wall and checked the list against actual inventory. The satellite phone was on 4B. She tested it powered on, showed a low charge, and she plugged it in to charge. The external defibrillator was in the hall. She checked the battery indicator, got the same reading she always got, and made a note. At 5:40, the cell signal dropped. At 5:52, Caleb Merritt hit the floor again, but this time it was not a flashback. She heard it from 2 rooms away. Not a crash, more of a sudden weight. A thud that had the specific quality of someone going down without any attempt to catch themselves. She was moving before she had consciously decided to move, which was a reflex she had spent 8 years trying to suppress and apparently had not fully succeeded. She pushed in room 14 and found him, on the floor beside the bed, face up, eyes open, both hands trying to push himself up and failing. His right hand was shaking. His left arm was doing nothing. Don't move, she said. She was already at his side. I went dizzy, he said. Stood up too fast. Where did you hit? She was already checking his head, no laceration. No visible impact point. His neck, though. He had caught the corner of the metal bed frame on the way down. Could see the mark. The exact kind of impact that you did not want on a cervical spine. My neck, he said, slower now. Hit the my neck. Can you feel your feet? A pause that was slightly too long. Caleb. Can you feel your feet? Yeah, he said. It's the way people said things when they were testing whether the answer was true and weren't sure of the result. Yeah, I can. But it's different. Tell me different. Far away. His voice had gone very controlled in the way that people went controlled when they were scared. Like I'm feeling them through a wall. Nora took a breath. She did not take many breaths during assessments. She took this one. Cervical impact. Altered sensation, bilateral lower extremity. Patient who had already been in a physically elevated state from the morning episode. The nearest hospital, Carver General Medical Center in Millhaven, was 47 miles away, on a road that was about to become impassable. "I'm going to touch your hands," she said. "Tell me what you feel." She touched the back of his right hand first. He said he felt it. Touched his left. Slower response, less certain. She ran a thumbnail lightly along his left forearm. He felt it, but the delay was longer than it should have been. "Okay," she said. "I need you to hold very still. I mean it. Don't try to help me. Don't adjust. Don't shift your weight. Can you do that?" "What's happening?" "I don't know yet." That was technically true. She knew enough. "I need to make some calls. Stay exactly as you are." She stood up and walked, didn't run, because running communicated panic, and she could not afford to communicate panic to the nursing station, and picked up the satellite phone, which had been charging for 40 minutes and showed 62%. She called the emergency line for Carver General. The dispatcher answered in 2 rings. "This is Nora Vance, contract nurse at Hartwell Veterans Recovery Center in Crane Falls. I have a patient with a suspected cervical spine injury following a fall with neck impact. Altered sensation, bilateral lower extremity, left side more compromised. I need a medical helicopter, and I need a flight window assessment immediately." The dispatcher asked the standard questions. She answered them without any unnecessary language. After 90 seconds, the dispatcher said, "We can have a helicopter in the air in approximately 30 minutes. Flight window from your location, given the incoming weather system. I'm showing maybe a 40-minute ceiling before we're grounded. I need a clear landing zone. The parking lot on the east side of the building is flat, lit, and approximately 60 by 40 feet. I'll have staff clear it." "Okay, keep the line." She put the phone on the counter and turned around. Colt was standing in the corridor. He had the expression of someone who had walked into a situation that was not on his schedule and was rapidly calculating how it reflected on him. "There's a helicopter coming," he said. "Yes." "Who authorized?" "The patient has a suspected cervical spine injury, and we are 47 miles from a hospital on a road that is icing over right now." She kept her voice level. "The physician on rotation left at 5. Night coverage doesn't arrive until 7. I'm the senior clinical person in this building. You are a contract." "Harlan." She used his first name deliberately, the way he used hers. "A helicopter is coming. It has a 40-minute flight window. Parking lot needs to be cleared, and I need 2 staff members in room 14 right now. We can discuss my employment status after the patient is on board." He stared at her. She picked up the phone. "What's the ETA on that flight crew?" The dispatcher said 28 minutes. 28 minutes. She walked back to room 14. She had improvised spinal immobilization in worse conditions. This was not the worst conditions. That thought kept her hands steady as she organized what was available: a wooden panel from the closet shelf that was solid enough, 2 firm blankets. The roll tells that Patricia collect from the linen storage, because Patricia had finally stopped pressing herself against the wall and started being useful. Darren stood in the doorway, asking questions. She answered in short, complete sentences without looking up from what she was doing. "What do I do?" he asked. "Go to the parking lot. Make sure every car on the east side is moved. Find Roy. Tell him to turn on every exterior light we have. Come back when that's done." He went. Caleb was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had spent time in situations where the person doing things with calm hands was the only anchor available. "You've done this before," he said. "Hold still. That's not a denial. It's not the time." She was positioning the rolled towels along his cervical spine with the precision of someone who had done this on uneven ground in the dark with incoming fire and found this version flat floor, lit room, 52% battery on the satellite phone said considerably more manageable. "I'm going to place this panel under you. It's going to be uncomfortable. Tell me immediately if you feel any change in sensation. Up or down. Either." He was quiet while she worked. Patricia held the flashlight, angled correctly, without being told. That was something. People surprised you sometimes. "Sparrow Two," Caleb said from the floor. Not now. I was in Kandahar, he said. 2017. Ground team attached to the 75th. Her hands did not stop. But something in her chest did a specific thing it hadn't done in a long time. Not now. There was a withdrawal order. Radio. Female voice. He paused. She called the abort 4 minutes before the blast zone was activated. We got 3 men out. Nora placed the last rolled towel, checked the panel's position. She did not look at him. 3 men didn't make it, she said, quietly. The way you said things you had carried for a long time. No, Caleb said. They were already gone, before the order. The room was very still. The timeline in the official report, she started, was wrong. His voice was steady now, not aggressive, not performative. Just a man saying a true thing to a person who needed to hear it. I read the raw comms 3 years later when they declassified part of the file. Your order went out at the right time. What went wrong was upstream. The signal delay on our end. That wasn't on you. Outside, through the window, Nora heard the distant sound of rotors cutting through the wind, the helicopter, fighting its way through the incoming storm, still 8 or 10 minutes out by the sound. She sat back on her heels. For a moment, just a moment, her face did something she couldn't entirely control. Then she got it back. Because there was work left to do, and she was going to do it, and she was going to get this man onto that aircraft without permanent damage to his spine, and everything else was going to have to wait. You're going to feel me place my hands on either side of your head, she said. I'm going to maintain this position until the flight crew arrives. Don't move. Don't turn toward sound. Keep your eyes on the ceiling. Copy that, Caleb Merritt said. And outside, the rotors got louder. And Harlan Colt stood in the doorway of room 14, watching a woman he had called just a contract nurse that same afternoon hold a man's life together with both hands in the middle of a Montana winter, and for the first time since he had taken the director's position at Hartwell Veterans Recovery Center. He did not say a single word. The helicopter set down crooked. That was the first thing Nora registered. When the rotors came fully into view through the east window, the aircraft, tilting on its approach, fighting a crosswind that had picked up in the last 6 minutes and was pushing hard from the northwest. Pilot corrected, overcorrected, and then settled the skids onto the parking lot. With a jolt that rattled the exterior lights, Roy had managed to get working on 3 of the 4 poles. The 4th had blown a breaker sometime in the last hour, and nobody had found the panel yet. She didn't move from her position. Both hands steady on either side of Caleb's head. She had been holding that position for 11 minutes. Her shoulders ached in a specific way that she associated with sustained isometric tension, something she had felt before in different circumstances, and she pushed the awareness of it to the back of her mind the way you pushed a drawer shut when the contents were inconvenient. They're here, Patricia said from the doorway. Tell them the patient's name, age, mechanism of injury, time of fall, and that I have cervical stabilization in place. Don't tell them anything else. Send them straight in. Patricia went. Nora heard footsteps in the corridor. 30 seconds later, 2 sets, quick and purposeful, and then 2 flight medics came through the door with a folded stretcher and a hard collar and the specific kind of eye contact that said they had been briefed and were ready to work. Taller one, blonde, late 20s. A name tag that said Ruiz took in the scene in about 2 seconds. His gaze moved from Caleb to Nora's hand, positioning to the improvised, cervical support she had assembled, and something in his expression shifted from assessment to something else. Good positioning, he said. Not a compliment, an acknowledgement. There was a difference. Left upper extremity response is slower than right, she said. He's had some return sensation in the lower extremities. Since I placed stabilization, and I think the initial compression may have been positional, but I didn't want to move him until you were here. Smart. Ruiz was already opening the hard collar. We'll take over from here. Can you maintain position while I place this? Yes. The handoff took 4 minutes. Clean, mostly. There was one moment when Caleb made a sound, not a cry, more like a sharp intake that he controlled immediately when the collar was seated and Nora's hands came away from his head. and she watched his face during that moment and saw him work through it the way military people worked through pain, which was by identifying it as information and then deciding what to do with the information and usually deciding to keep moving. "You good?" Ruiz asked him. "Functional," Caleb said, which was not the same thing as yes, but was the only answer that kind of person gave. They loaded him to the stretcher with 6 people and the wooden panel, which Nora had positioned specifically for this, so it could serve as a transfer board without requiring him to be lifted fully off the floor and then repositioned. Ruiz noted that. She saw him note it. He didn't say anything, which was the appropriate response. Harlan Colt was in the corridor when they moved Caleb out. He had his arms folded and the expression of a man calculating damage. Nora walked beside the stretcher and did not look at him. "I'll need to accompany to the hospital," she told Ruiz. "Protocol is family or medical proxy. He has no family listed in the file. I'm the treating nurse and I have information about his neurological baseline from this morning's episode that will be relevant to the trauma team." She kept walking. "I'm coming." Ruiz glanced at his partner, a shorter woman named Devlin, who had not spoken yet but had done everything exactly right, and Devlin gave a small shrug that was not an objection. Ruiz looked forward again. "You ride in front," he said. Colt's voice came from behind her. "Nora, you're not authorized to leave the facility during your shift." She stopped. She turned around. She looked at him standing in the corridor with his arms still folded, and she felt something she usually kept very well managed, a kind of cold, clarifying anger that had nothing to do with losing control and everything to do with seeing something clearly for the first time, without the filter of professional courtesy. "Write it up," she said. "Put it in my file." She turned back around and walked out into the January wind. The flight to Millhaven was 32 minutes. Nora sat in the front seat and watched the pilot, a compact woman with a gray braid tucked under her helmet, who had not introduced herself and didn't seem to feel she needed to navigate the crosswind with the focused economy of someone who did not waste movement. The storm was tracking faster than the weather service had predicted. Through the windshield, Nora could see it building to the northwest, a wall of cloud that had the particular density of serious snow, not the light decorative variety, but the kind that made roads disappear. In the back, she could hear Ruiz talking to Caleb in the low, steady cadence of in-flight patient monitoring. She heard Caleb answer, short responses, controlled, and she could tell from the rhythm of the exchange that he was holding steady. Altered sensation in his left side had not worsened. That was either good news or a pause before worse news, and she had learned that you took the pause. She did not think about what Caleb had told her on the floor of room 14. She tried not to. She had spent 8 years building a very particular structure around the events of one night in 2017, and the structure had been functional, if not exactly livable. It had allowed her to get up in the morning, to do the work, to be useful in the specific way that she knew how to be useful. The structure was built on a foundation of responsibility, not guilt, she had told herself, because guilt was self-indulgent, but responsibility, which was different. Responsibility meant you carried the weight of what had happened without letting it crush you, without dramatizing it, without asking to be absolved of it. 3 men had died. She had given an order. The order had been 4 minutes too late. That was the structure. And Caleb Merritt, lying on a linoleum floor in one sock, had said the timeline in the official report was wrong. She stared at the storm through the windshield and did not let herself move too fast toward that. She had seen enough people build false hope out of new information and then fall harder when the full picture came in. She would wait for the full picture. The pilot said, "Carver General in 8, and Nora nodded. The trauma bay at Carver General Medical Center was organized in the specific, controlled chaos of an ER that knew a spinal case was coming and had prepared accordingly. 2 nurses, an attending, a radiology technician, with a portable unit already wheeled into position. The attending was a broad-shouldered man named Doctor. Elliot Marsh, who had the gray-templed competence of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and had stopped being impressed by things, but had also stopped dismissing things, which was the more useful trait. He listened to Nora's handoff report mechanism, timeline, initial presentation, neurological changes with the kind of attention that was not passive. He asked 2 questions. She answered them in complete sentences without elaboration. You stabilized him how? He asked. She described the wooden panel and the rolled towels and the transfer board positioning. Marsh looked at her for a moment. Not a long moment, but a real one. Contract nurse? Yes. He nodded. He turned back to Caleb. Let's get him to imaging. She stayed in the waiting area. There was a chair with a split vinyl cushion and a vending machine that had run out of everything except apple juice, and a brand of cracker she had never heard of. She sat in the chair and drank bad coffee from a paper cup that someone on the nursing staff had offered her, and she looked at the wall and thought about nothing with the focused intensity of a person who was thinking about everything and choosing not to name it. Ruiz found her there 20 minutes later. He sat in the adjacent chair. There was another one, also vinyl, also functional, but not comfortable, and he looked at her sideways, the way people did when they wanted to say something and were organizing it first. Where'd you train? He asked. Nursing program at Clement University. She paused. Trauma skills are from before that. He nodded. He had the look of someone who had already worked that out. Military? I don't really talk about it. Fair. He was quiet for a moment. Stabilization you did was solid. I've seen flight crews do worse with a full kit. Stayed still. That helped. He'd stayed still because of how you talked to him. Ruiz leaned back in the chair. I've been doing this 4 years. People don't stay still because you tell them to. They stay still because they trust the voice telling them. Nora looked at the wall. Is that a compliment or a clinical observation? Both. He stood up. Marsh is good. Your guy's in the right place. He paused before he went back through the doors. For what it's worth, whatever you were before, it didn't leave. She didn't answer. He went back through the doors. She sat with that for a while. It had the uncomfortable quality of a true thing said by a stranger. Dr. Marsh came out at 11:40 with imaging on a tablet that he turned to show her before he said anything which she appreciated. The scan showed a fracture C5, incomplete, with evidence of temporary nerve compression that had partially resolved. The altered sensation Caleb had described was consistent with the imaging. The news was not good, but it was not the worst version of not good. His mobility outcome is going to depend on surgical decompression and how fast we move, Marsh said. The good news is the compression appears to have been positional, which is consistent with what you found on presentation. He may have had some self-correction when he went from the floor to a neutral position. He paused. Your immobilization kept him from making it worse while we were getting here. That's not a small thing. It's what the situation required, Nora said. Marsh looked at her. He had the expression of someone revising a working theory. You got military training? I had a career before nursing. What branch? She was quiet for a beat too long. Army, she said. He nodded. He didn't push. I'm going to need his next of kin authorization for surgery. You said there's no family listed? Emergency contact in the file is a former team member named Joel Pardee. Phone number listed. The facility should have it. She paused. Hartwell is going to be difficult to reach. The storm hit the cell network there around 5:50. The satellite phone I was using will still be operational. I'll have my coordinator reach out. He looked at the tablet again. Surgery's in 2 hours. Someone from the board will want to talk to you before then. Routine. We'll need your account of the mechanism and response timeline for the medical record. Fine. He started back toward the doors. She said, Doctor? Marsh, he turned. Will he walk? Marsh looked at her with the careful honesties of a surgeon who had learned that false reassurance was a form of cruelty. I think so. I'm not certain. 2 hours will tell us more than I can tell you right now. He held her gaze for a moment. He's lucky you were in that room. He went back through the doors. Nora sat down again in the split vinyl chair. She put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands not to cry. She wasn't going to cry, but because there was a specific kind of exhaustion that was not about sleep and needed somewhere to go. She let it sit there for about 40 seconds. Then she straightened up, pushed her hair back, and looked at the vending machine. She bought the apple juice. She drank it. It was too sweet and slightly warm. Anyway, the hospital coordinator found her at midnight with a release form and a request from the board liaison. A thin man in his 50s named Gerald Price, who wore a visitor's badge and had the particular energy of someone who existed to assess institutional risk, and had arrived at this hospital for exactly that purpose. He shook her hand in the way that people who were not sure if you were an asset or a liability shook hands, with information gathering in the grip. "Ms. Vance," he said, "thank you for everything you did tonight. We just want to get the account straight for the record." "Sure." They sat in a small consultation room off the main waiting area. Price had a notepad and a voice recorder that he placed on the table with a question in his expression, which she read as asking permission. She nodded. He turned it on. He walked her through the timeline with the systematic patience of someone building a case. She answered every question in exact sequence. She did not editorialize. She described the mechanism, her assessment, the decisions she had made, and the clinical rationale for each. When he asked about the improvised immobilization device, she explained what she had used and why. When he asked about contacting the helicopter service, she described the satellite phone, the charge level, the dispatcher exchange. When he asked whether she had informed the facility director before authorizing the flight, she paused. "I informed him that a helicopter was coming," she said. "Authorization was mine, made on the basis of clinical necessity in the absence of a physician and the impossibility of ground transport." "And did Director Colt contest that?" "He was in the doorway. He said I wasn't authorized to leave the facility during my shift." Price wrote something on his notepad. "And you left anyway." "Patient needed the hospital. I had information relevant to his care." She met Price's eyes. "The director had a facility to run. I had a patient to get to surgery." Price looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite classify, not hostile, not friendly, more like recalibrating. "One more thing," he said. "Dr. Marsh noted in his preliminary intake record that you described the stabilization method as, and I'm quoting his notes, consistent with military field protocols for cervical immobilization in sans environments. He asked whether you had combat medical training. I told him I had a career before nursing." "Which was?" "Quiet. Ms. Vance." For the medical record. She looked at the voice recorder. She looked at Price. She had kept the door closed for 8 years, and every time she had made that choice, it had felt like self-preservation. And also, underneath that, like something smaller and less honest. She thought about Caleb Merritt telling her, from a linoleum floor, that the timeline in the report was wrong. She thought about what Ruiz had said in the waiting room chair. "Whatever you were before, it didn't leave." "Army," she said. "Combat medic. 2 deployments. I was attached to special operations evacuation units on classified assignments." She stopped. Price wrote. He did not look up. "Can you provide documentation of that service? It's on file with the Department of Defense. Parts of it are classified." She paused. "Parts relevant to this situation are not." Price capped his pen. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had walked into a room expecting a small administrative matter and found something considerably larger. "I'll need to follow up with the facility," he said. "Hartwell's emergency preparedness rate is going to come under review given tonight's circumstances." "That review is overdue," Nora said. She said it without heat, as a fact. Price looked at her for a moment, then clicked off the recorder, and she had the sense, not certainty, but sense that something had just shifted in a direction she could not yet see clearly. She found out about the call from Colt at 2 in the morning, which was when her satellite phone showed a voicemail from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be the Hartwell administrative line. She was sitting in the corridor outside the surgical suite, which she had no clinical reason to be near, but had drifted toward anyway, and she played the voicemail once. Colt's voice was controlled. It was always controlled. He said that he was documenting her unauthorized departure from the facility during an active shift. He said that he was also noting her failure to follow emergency protocol by contacting hospital services without physician authorization. He said, and here his voice dropped to the register he used, when he was being very precise that her contract was under review and that she should not report for her next scheduled shift until she had met with him and the facility's HR representative. She put the phone in her pocket. She leaned her head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling of the Carper General corridor and felt the full weight of the situation settle onto her. Not just what Colt was doing she had seen, that coming with the clarity of watching weather move across a mountain range, but everything underneath it. The 8 months of memos that went nowhere. The expired medications and untested defibrillators and short-staffed night shifts and veterans who deserved better than a director whose primary expertise was making institutional failure look like individual failure. And now she was sitting outside a surgical suite at 2 a.m, her contract under review, her shift effectively suspended, in a hospital 47 miles from her apartment because she had done the right thing at the right moment and the person with authority over her employment had decided that was a problem. The absurdity of it sat heavily enough that she made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. Dr. Marsh came out of the surgical suite at 2:27. He was still in scrubs. He looked tired in the clean, satisfied way of someone who had done difficult work and had done difficult work and had it go the right direction. "He's out," Marsh said. "Decompression went well. We'll know more on sensation and mobility as he comes out of anesthesia, but the surgical picture was better than the pre-op imaging suggested. The fracture site was stable. The cord itself doesn't show structural damage." Nora let out a breath she had been holding in pieces for several hours. "He's going to need significant rehabilitation," Marsh continued, "probably talking months. But I think walking is on the table." He looked at her. "You're still here. I wanted to know." He nodded. "You should get some sleep. There's nothing more you can do tonight." She knew that. She also knew that sleep was several hours, and a 47-mile drive away, neither of which were currently available to her, given that she had ridden here in a helicopter, and the storm had closed the road. "Is there a place I can wait?" she asked. Marsh pointed down the corridor. "Family waiting area on the 3rd floor has couches. Not comfortable, but horizontal." "That's enough," she said. She was 2 steps away when he said, "Ms. Vance, the board liaison Price. He's going to file a full incident review report in the morning." He said it carefully, like he was handing her something fragile. "Told him my clinical assessment of your intervention. For what it's worth." She looked back at him. "Thank you," she said. She meant it simply. He nodded simply. That was enough. She did not sleep much. Couch on the 3rd floor was orange vinyl and curved in a way that suited nobody's spine, and the quarter light stayed on at 70% because hospitals did not have real dark, only lesser degrees of fluorescent. She lay on her side with her jacket pulled over her shoulders and stared at the far wall and let her mind do what it was going to do. She thought about 2017. She thought about it in the way she had trained herself to think about it, as a sequence of events, not as a feeling. The mission profile, the timeline, the radio communication, the order she had given, the 4 minutes. She had reviewed the official report so many times in the first 2 years after that. She had it memorized. The sequence was clear. Evacuation order transmitted at 23:14. Blast event at 23:18. 3 casualties confirmed at the site. Timeline said her order had come 4 minutes before the event. 4 minutes that had not been enough. But Caleb had said the raw comms told a different story. Signal delay. Our end. She pressed her face into the back of the couch cushion and exhaled hard. If the delay had been on their receiving end, if the order had gone out on time and arrived late because of a transmission failure she had no way of knowing about, then the 4 minutes wasn't her 4 minutes. The margin wasn't her margin. She didn't know if she believed that yet. She was also aware, in the honest part of herself, that she didn't know if she was capable of believing it. 8 years of a structure built on one foundation, you were too late, was not something that dissolved in 30 seconds on a linoleum floor because a man she barely knew said the report was wrong. She needed the file, she needed the raw data, she needed something she could actually see, not just testimony, because testimony from someone with reasons to make you feel better was not evidence. But it was something. It was the first something in 8 years. She was still awake when the corridor lights shifted to full brightness and the hospital began its early morning routine, the cartwheels and the shift changes and the distant conversation of people who had been up, all night becoming the people who had just arrived. She sat up, psychsate. Her back hurt. Her shoulder, the one that had been holding position for 11 minutes, felt like it had been clamped in a vise. She went to find the bathroom and then found coffee, which was in a small family consultation room on the 3rd floor, and was terrible and exactly what she needed. She stood at the window with the coffee and watched the parking lot below, where the storm had deposited 8 inches of snow overnight, and the first maintenance truck was making slow passes with a blade that was clearly not quite adequate for the job. Her phone showed 4 messages. One from Patricia, "How is he? Everyone here is worried," which was more than she had expected from Patricia. One from Roy Hebert, "Heard what happened. That defibrillator in the hall was replaced this morning." Colt's orders. She read that one twice. The timing of it was interesting. One from a number she didn't know she let that one sit. And one from Colt sent at 6:48. "Report to my office at 10 a.m. HR will be present." She replied to Patricia. "Surgery went well. He's stable." She replied to Roy with nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be used somehow. She did not reply to Colt. She opened the unknown number. The text said, "This is Joel Pardee, Caleb's emergency contact. Hospital called me last night. I'm flying in this morning. I need to talk to you." She stared at it. Then the second message, sent 20 minutes after the first. "I know who you are. Sparrow 2. I was in Kandahar." Coffee cup in her hand was very still. Her heartbeat, however, was not. She looked at the text again, then put the phone face down on the windowsill and looked at the parking lot where the maintenance truck was making another slow pass. Blade was still not adequate. Snow kept piling back into the lane it had just cleared. Picked the phone back up. She typed, "When do you land?" The response came in 40 seconds, 930. "Don't go anywhere." She looked at the message for a long moment. She looked at the storm through the window, at the still coming down, at the road below that was still not quite passable. She had spent 8 years going somewhere, away, forward, elsewhere. She had been very good at it. She typed, "I'll be here," and 3 floors below, in a recovery room she hadn't been allowed into yet. Caleb Merritt was coming out of anesthesia, and the first thing he asked the nurse, checking his vitals before he asked about the surgery, before he asked about his legs, was whether the woman from the helicopter ride was still in the building. The nurse who answered Caleb's question was named Adrienne, and she was patient and professional and told him that she didn't have information about other staff in the building, which was the correct answer, and 6:60 and also the wrong one. He asked again at 6:50, more specifically this time. The woman from Hartwell, the one who came in on the helicopter, and Adrienne said she would check, and then went to do something else, because she had 7 other patients, and a shift that had started at 5, and a man asking about a staff member from another facility was not her most pressing concern. Caleb lay in the recovery bed and looked at the ceiling and took inventory of his body, the way he had learned to do after every significant event systematically, starting at the top and moving down, not with dread, but with the pragmatic curiosity of someone who had been trained to work with what was available. His head was clear, his neck was immobilized in a hard collar, and there was a dull, pressurized ache radiating from C5 that he recognized as post-surgical rather than injury, which was a meaningful distinction. His arms were both present and responding. Left slightly slower than right, but present. His legs, he moved his right foot first, then his left both moved, not strongly, not without effort. But they moved, And the sensation, while muted and strange, was there in a way. It had not been on the floor of room 14 when he had been telling himself far away, just far away, it's fine, and not entirely believing it. He was going to walk. He didn't know the surgical outcome in technical terms yet, but he had been in enough recovery rooms, 3 knee surgeries, 2 shoulder reconstructions, a nerve graft after a shrapnel incident in 2019 that everyone had told him would end his career, and hadn't to read the particular quality of pain that meant you will recover versus the quality that meant something else. It was the first kind. He asked a different nurse at 7:15 whether there was any way to get a message to the waiting area on the 3rd floor. Nora got the message at 7:40. A folded piece of paper delivered by an orderly who seemed slightly uncertain about the whole enterprise, on which someone had written in block letters that were clearly made by a person who had not done a lot of handwriting recently. Still here, both feet. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she went back to the window and the coffee that had gone cold again. 9:17, Joel Pardee walked out of the elevator at the end of the corridor. She knew it was him before he reached her, the way you sometimes knew things that you couldn't explain through conscious observation. A combination of posture, movement, and the specific way he was looking at the waiting area, like someone who had been in more difficult rooms than this one and was prepared for the conversation ahead. He was black, mid-40s, with a shaved head and a jacket that was not quite heavy enough for Montana in January, which meant he had flown in from somewhere warmer and had not had time to plan for the weather. He walked with a slight forward lean that was not quite a limp, but was the residual memory of one. He saw her and stopped. He looked at her the way Caleb had looked at her, that unclassifiable expression, like she was something that existed in 2 categories simultaneously. Sparrow Two, he said. That's not a name I use anymore, she said. I know. He sat in the chair across from her. He had the directness of someone who had decided on the flight over that there was no useful purpose in preamble. How is he? Surgery went well. He's in recovery. Sensation is returning. I think he'll have mobility. She paused. I'm not the treating physician. Those are my observations. I'll take your observations. He folded his hands on his knees. You were the one who stabilized him. Yes. And you were the one who got him on the helicopter. Yes. And you're the one who's been working at Hartwell for 8 months under a nursing license when you spent 6 years as a combat medic attached to JSOC-adjacent operations. She looked at him steadily. I have a nursing license. That's not a cover. I know it's not. He wasn't accusing. He was establishing. There was a difference. I'm trying to understand why someone with your background chose Crane Falls, Montana. Because it was quiet. It's not quiet anymore. No, she agreed. It's not. Pardee looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the snow had thinned from overnight storm to a steady, lighter fall. I need to tell you something, he said. And I need you to hear it as information, not as absolution. Because I don't have the authority to offer absolution, and I don't think you'd take it from me anyway. She didn't say anything. He read that correctly as permission. I was the signals officer on the Kandahar Ridge operation, he said. 2017, I was the one managing radio traffic between your position and ours. He was quiet for a moment. There was a relay failure on our receiving equipment. A hardware fault intermittent, which is the worst kind, because it doesn't show up consistently enough to catch before you need it. Your transmission went out at 23:11. We received it at 23:14. 3-minute gap was ours. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. The official report logged receipt time as transmission time, he continued. That was an administrative error. I don't know if it was intentional or not. I've spent 7 years deciding it was probably just bureaucratic sloppiness, but I can't be certain. When the report came out and the timeline showed a 4-minute gap, I flagged it through my chain of command. I was told it was within acceptable margin for classified operation review, and the report would stand. Nora's hands were very still in her lap. You filed a flag, she said. I filed a flag. It went nowhere. His jaw moved. I was 28 years old, and I didn't push hard enough, and that is something I have also carried. He looked at her directly. I'm not telling you this to make you feel better. I'm telling you because Caleb asked me to find you 3 years ago when he saw the declassified partial report, and you had effectively disappeared, and we just found you last night by accident. She exhaled through her nose, very slowly. 3 years, she said. You're hard to find when you want to be. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at him. The partial declassification, what does it show? Transmission logs from the relay station. Timestamp differential, 3 minutes and 40 seconds between broadcast and confirmed receipt. The raw data is there if you know what you're reading. He paused. I can get you the file. It takes a week and a phone call to someone who owes me. I want to see the file. I know. He leaned forward. Right now, I need to tell you something else. Something that happened this morning. She waited. On the flight out, I made some calls. Pardee's voice shifted register, still even, but tighter. About Hartwell, about Colt. He pulled out his phone and found something, turned it to show her. Your director has been operating a facility with documented staffing violation, going back 2 years. State Licensing Board has 3 unresolved complaints. He also has a habit, apparently, of protecting himself by building paper trails against employees who catch problems he'd rather not acknowledge. She looked at the screen. She could see a document header, an official state health licensing form. But the text was small and she couldn't read the details. She looked back at Pardee. Who did you call? She asked. People who pay attention to how veterans are being treated in residential care facilities. His expression was not quite a smile. Not quite. Caleb is not nobody, Nora. He's got people who watch out for him. And when those people found out that the nurse who got him to surgery in a storm in a helicopter was being suspended for doing it, he stopped. Colt made some calls this morning, too. Apparently, he contacted the state licensing board to file a complaint about your conduct last night. Unsupervised clinical decision-making, unauthorized departure, practicing outside scope. Nora felt the specific weight of that land. He moved fast, she said. He's scared, Pardee said. Scared people move fast and sloppy. He looked at her. Your 10 o'clock meeting, you should go to it. He's going to terminate my contract. I know. Pardee pocketed his phone. Go anyway, and take your documentation. She drove back to Crane Falls in Pardee's rental car, which he insisted on because the road was technically open, but still carrying residual ice, and his rental had better tires than anything else available, and he drove while she sat in the passenger seat with her documentation folder on her lap. A manila envelope she had kept in her apartment from the beginning, which contained printed copies of every memo, every flagged concern, every unanswered requisition, time-stamped, organized chronologically, because she had learned the hard way that the time to organize documentation was before you needed it. The drive took an hour and 20 minutes. Mostly didn't talk. Pardee drove with the focused competence of someone who had driven in worse conditions, and Nora looked out at the landscape, the snow-covered forest, the occasional structure visible through the tree line, particular quality of Montana in January, which was that everything looked simultaneously beautiful and indifferent to whether you survived it and thought about what she was walking into. Hartwell looked different in daylight after a storm. Parking lot had been plowed, badly, with snow piled against the east side, where the helicopter had landed and the exterior lights Roy had turned on the night before were off now in the thin January daylight. 2 cars she didn't recognize were in the parking lot alongside the staff vehicles. One of them had state government plates. She looked at it as she got out of the car. She looked at Pardee. I made some calls on the road, too, he said. He was not apologetic about it. She walked inside. The lobby of Hartwell had a particular feeling that morning, a held-breath quality, like a room where everyone has been told something is happening, but not what. Tricia was at the nursing station and looked up when Nora came in with an expression that mixed relief and anxiety in roughly equal proportion. Roy Habert was in the corridor near the supply room, with his arms folded, doing nothing visibly purposeful, which meant he was watching. 3 staff members she passed in the east corridor all found reasons to be doing something else and did not make eye contact. Colt's office door was closed. She could hear voices through it his, and at least two others she didn't recognize. She sat in the chair outside his office. She put the manila envelope on her knee. She had arrived at 9:53, which was 7 minutes early, and she used the 7 minutes to look at the framed photographs on the corridor wall veterans. At various events, group photos, a few individual portraits of men and women in uniforms with the facility's name in the frame borders, and she thought about Colt putting those photographs in fundraising materials, without asking the people in them, which was something she had learned from Roy 6 weeks ago, and written down in her notes on a date she could now look up precisely if anyone asked her to. At exactly 10, the door opened. Colt stood in the doorway. Behind him were two people she had not seen before, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, who turned out to be Sandra Pratt, the facility's HR consultant, and a man in a state-issued vest who did not introduce himself immediately and whose presence Colt was visibly unhappy about. "Come in," Colt said. His voice had the quality of someone who had planned a conversation and found that the room was not the one they'd prepared for. She went in. The man in the state vest introduced himself as Inspector Warren Dale, Office of Healthcare Facility, Licensing and Compliance, and he shook her hand with the neutral efficiency of someone who had learned to give nothing away in initial contact. He had a briefcase. He sat to the side, not at the desk. Colt sat behind the desk. Sandra Pratt sat beside Colt, in the position of someone trying to determine which side of the table she was actually on. "This is an employment matter," Colt said to Dale. "The inspector's presence. Inspector Dale is here in connection with a compliance review initiated this morning," Dale said. "I won't interrupt your proceedings. I'm observing." Colt's expression did the thing it did when he was angry, and choosing not to show it, a very slight compression around the eyes and a deliberate relaxation of the jaw that was actually more tense than a natural jaw would be. He turned to Nora. "As I communicated in my messages," he said, "we are conducting a review of last night's events. Unauthorized departure, the unsupervised clinical interventions, the decision to contact emergency services without physician authorization." He had a file folder open in front of him. She could see her name on the tab. "Given the pattern of conduct issues in your file, I'd like to address those items individually," Nora said. "We'll get to the physician authorization." She opened her envelope. "Montana's State Code for Emergency Nursing Intervention, in the absence of physician coverage." Printed it. She slid the page across the desk. "In the absence of a physician and in a situation constituting immediate threat to patient life or function, the senior licensed nurse may initiate emergency care, including transport authorization." Dr. Marsh's intake notes confirmed the injury met that threshold. Colt looked at the page. Sandra Pratt looked at it too and leaned slightly away from Colt's shoulder. "The unauthorized departure," Nora continued. She slid another page. "My contract, Section 4C. Emergency patient escort is an authorized reason for off-site activity when the nurse is the most qualified staff member to provide continuity of care. I was the only staff member with knowledge of the patient's neurological baseline from the morning episode, which Dr. Marsh has already documented as clinically relevant." Dale was saying something in his notebook. "The pattern of conduct issues," Nora said, placed the rest of the envelope's contents on the desk, not scattered, organized in date order. 3 internal memos regarding emergency preparedness, 2 equipment flagging reports, 1 formal staffing concern submission through the intake channel, all submitted between September and December of last year. She looked at Colt, none of which received a substantive response. The room was quiet. Colt looked at the stack of papers. His face was doing something she had not seen it do before, a very subtle recalibration, like a man finding that the ground he thought was solid had a different quality than expected. "Those memos were received and processed," he said. "I'd like to see the processing records," she said, "in writing." Sandra Pratt, who had been very still for the last 3 minutes, uncapped her pen and wrote something on her notepad and did not show it to Colt. "There's also the matter," Nora continued, of the defibrillator in the main corridor, which had an unverified battery since last March. I flagged it twice. It was replaced this morning. She looked at him after last night's incident. Dale stopped writing and looked up. And the photographs, Nora said. Colt went very still. The veterans in the fundraising materials, she said. The November appeal and the December board presentation both used photographs of patients taken during their stay here. I have 3 residents who, to my knowledge, did not sign image release authorization for external use. She slid one more page across a printed copy of the facility's own patient privacy policy. Section 7, Media and Image Usage. Roy Hebert confirmed the images were used without formal release. He was uncomfortable about it at the time. Colt looked at her. Controlled expression had developed a crack in it, not in his voice, not in his posture, but somewhere behind the eyes, where people kept the things they were most worried about. This is not the meeting I convened, he said. No, Nora agreed. It's not. Inspector Dale set down his pen. Ms. Vance, I'm going to need copies of those documents for the compliance review. I brought originals and copies, she said. She separated the copies from the stack and handed them to Dale. The originals I'll keep. She left his office 40 minutes later, without a termination. That was not a victory, she understood that. A contract under review was still a contract under review, and Colt was still behind the desk, and Sandra Pratt had said almost nothing, and the compliance review would take weeks. But Dale had asked for the full document stack. Dale had asked for the names of staff who could speak to the emergency preparedness concerns. Dale had asked, at the end, with the careful neutrality of a state official who had heard enough to have a working theory, whether there were any other incidents she felt were relevant to the review. She had given him Roy's name. She had given him Patricia's name. She had given him the contact information for a physical therapist named Marcus Webb, who had worked at Hartwell for 3 years, and had told her 6 weeks ago and twice since that he had raised equipment concerns through his own chain and been told to document them, as resolved even when they weren't. She had given Dale everything she had. That was all she could do with it. She walked to the nursing station and found Patricia still there and still looking at her, with that complicated expression. How is he? Patricia asked. Caleb. Really, I think he'll walk. It'll take time. Patricia nodded. She looked down at something on her desk and then back up. Colt told us this morning that you had filed false internal reports about equipment to cover your unauthorized conduct last night. She said it in the tone of someone who had been told something and had been turning it over since. He said the memos were an attempt to create a retroactive paper trail. Nora looked at her. Do you believe that? Patricia was quiet for a moment. No, she said. Because I saw the IV tubing requisition in September. I signed off on the needs assessment myself. Then tell that to Inspector Dale when he asks you. He will ask you. Patricia nodded. Then she said, with the careful precision of someone delivering important information, there are 2 men in the common room. They've been here since 8:30. They asked specifically for you. Colt told them you weren't here. One of them. Older one, he has a military bearing. Not making a scene, just waiting. Nora looked down the corridor toward the common room. Did they give names? The older one gave a card. Patricia slid it across the desk. It was a plain white card with a name, Colonel Raymond Alt, U. S. Army, Rhett and a number. Nora picked up the card. She looked at it. She did not know that name. She also knew, with the specific instinct developed over 6 years, attached to operations, where things had a way of being connected through channels she hadn't been read into, that this was not a coincidence. Nobody drove to Crane Falls, Montana in January, the day after a helicopter emergency, and sat in the common room of a veterans recovery facility at 8:30 in the morning by coincidence. She walked to the common room. There were 2 of them. Colonel Alt was in his 60s, civilian clothes, the kind of straight-backed posture that didn't require a uniform to communicate rank. The younger man beside him was maybe 35, darker-haired, with the watchful stillness that Nora associated with people who spent a lot of time in positions where situational awareness was survival. He had a laptop bag. He had not opened it. Alt stood when she came in, extended his hand. "Ms. Vance," he said, "thank you for seeing us." "I didn't agree to see you," she said. She shook his hand anyway, because dismissing a retired colonel in a recovery facility. Common room was not a productive opening move. "Who are you and why are you here?" "Straight to it," he said. "Not a complaint." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit. This is going to take a few minutes." She sat. He sat. The younger man he was introduced as Captain Ben Ferris, which raised more questions than it answered, since active duty captains did not typically sit in veterans' facility. Common rooms making unscheduled calls, opened the laptop bag, but kept it closed. "We know about last night," Alt said. "We know about Caleb Merritt and the helicopter and the injury and the surgery. We know about your documentation and the compliance review that's apparently begun this morning." "How?" she said. "Joel Pardee called us at 6 this morning." He looked at her steadily. Joel Pardee has been for the last 4 years an informal consultant to the Army's Veteran Care Oversight Program. It is not a formal role. He does it because of what happened in 2017 and because he spent 3 years looking for you and couldn't find you. Nora looked at him. "We also know who you are," Alt continued. "Not Nora Vance, the contract nurse. The other version. The one with 6 years attached to JSOC-adjacent evacuation operations, 2 deployments, and a classified commendation you never collected because you left before the paperwork cleared." She had not known about the commendation. "I don't have a commendation," she said. "It's in a file." Alt's expression was not unkind. "You left before they could give it to you. It's been sitting there." He paused, "which is neither here nor there. What matters right now is that this facility has a compliance review beginning, a director who is apparently attempting to use your conduct as a shield for institutional negligence, and a state inspector on site who has your documentation, but not yet the full picture of your background." "My background is my business," she said. "Normally I would agree with you," Alt said. "Colt filed a complaint with the state licensing board this morning, alleging that your clinical interventions last night constituted practicing above your licensure level and that your training background was misrepresented in your contract application." He waited a beat. "That's a license revocation level complaint if it gains traction." The specific weight of that settled into the room. "I was hired as a licensed nurse," she said. "I am a licensed nurse. Everything I did last night was within nursing scope with the combat medicine background as supporting competence, not primary authority. I know that. Inspector Dale will know that after he reviews everything." Alt leaned forward. "But Colt's complaint, if it stands, can delay the process long enough to end your employment and damage your license before the facts catch up. He knows how bureaucratic timelines work." "So do I," she said. "Good." Alt looked at Captain Ferris, who opened the laptop bag and produced a sealed document folder. "Then you'll understand why we'd like to formally verify your military service record with the state board as supporting documentation for your Colt's complaint is profile before Colt's complaint is processed." He slid the folder across the low common room table. "This is a request for your authorization. If you sign it, we can have a full verification filed with the board by end of business today." Nora looked at the folder. She looked at Alt. "The classified portions," she said, "remain classified. The verifiable portions, training certifications, field medic qualifications, commendation eligibility are releasable with your signature." Picked up the folder. She opened it. The authorization form was exactly what he had described, a standard military records release. Specific in scope, nothing open-ended. She read it twice. She picked up the pen that Ferris had placed beside the folder without comment. She was holding the pen when the door to the common room opened and Colt walked in. He looked at Alt. He looked at Ferris. He looked at the document on the table and the pen in Nora's hand, and he had the expression, for just a fraction of a second, of a man watching something happen that he had been trying to prevent and had not moved fast enough to stop. "This room is for patient use," he said. His voice was perfect, absolutely controlled. "Outside appointments need to be coordinated through administration." "We're not an outside appointment," Alt said. He did not stand, which was a specific kind of communication. We're here in connection with a veteran welfare matter. Mr. Merritt is a patient of this facility. Mr. Merritt is currently at Carver General Minus. He was a patient of this facility. His care history here is under review. Alt looked at Colt with the patient, slightly bored expression of someone who had outranked people for 30 years and found the experience unremarkable. Director Colt, we'll be finished here shortly. Colt looked at Nora. She signed the form. She held his gaze while she did it. He did not look away. She watched him process what the signature meant, that the service record was going in, that the full picture of who she was and what she had actually done and how qualified she actually was would be available to the state board before his complaint was processed. And she watched him understand that the version of events he had been, instructing, the one where she was an overreaching contract nurse who had manufactured a crisis to cover her own inadequacy, had just developed a problem it could not recover from. Put the pen down. He turned and walked out of the common room. Alt looked at the closed door, then at Nora. He's going to call someone, he said. I know. He's going to try to get ahead of this. I know that too. She closed the folder and slid it back across to Ferris. What happens now? Now it processes. Alt stood, extended his hand again. You should know the 3 men from Kandahar. Their families have been told the same thing. Caleb told you. The timeline correction. It went through an informal channel 3 years ago. He paused. Doesn't fix anything. But the record is different now. Stood. She shook his hand. Her hand was completely steady. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He and Ferris moved toward the door. At the threshold, Alt stopped and looked back at her with the evaluating expression of someone who had made his assessment and found it satisfactory. For what it's worth, Ms. Vance, he said. The commendation was for the Kandahar withdrawal order. The review board determined the order was given correctly and timely. It's in the file, too. He left. Nora stood in the empty common room for a long moment. The television was on low. Someone had changed it from the sports channel to a news program, and a weather graphic was showing the storm system moving east, out of Montana, toward the plains. Roy had told her that first week that storms here moved fast. You got the worst of them, and then they were gone. And the sky went very clear and very cold, and everything looked sharp-edged and new. She picked up Colonel Alt's card from the table and put it in her pocket, next to the folded note from Caleb that said, Still here, both feet. She walked back to the nursing station. She picked up her shift report from where she had left it. She noted the time 11:42 and the date, and she began to write. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Patricia looked up. Then Nora looked up. Inspector Dale was coming toward them with his briefcase and a second man she hadn't seen. Arrived someone with a different kind of lanyard, a different agency logo, and behind them, 3 steps back, was Harlan Colt, and his face had the expression of a man who had made the phone call he thought would fix things, and had discovered somewhere in the middle of it that the person on the other end of the line already knew everything he was trying to say. Dale stopped at the nursing station. He looked at Nora. Ms. Vance, he said, I'm going to need to expand the scope of this review. We've received additional information this morning. He glanced briefly at Colt, then back to her. I'd like to speak with you and several staff members separately this afternoon. I also need access to the facility's emergency equipment maintenance logs going back 24 months. Nora looked at him steadily. I'll get you everything you need. Good. Dale set his briefcase on the nursing station counter and opened it, and whatever Colt had been trying to prevent had the look of something that had already happened, moving now through its own momentum, past the point where any single phone call could redirect it. The television in the common room was still running. On the screen, the storm graphic had been replaced by a clear weather forecast, cold, still, visibility unlimited. And somewhere at Carver General Medical Center in Millhaven, 47 miles away, Caleb Merritt asked the morning nurse for a phone. He needed to make a call. He had a name from a sealed partial file, a name that had sat in the back of his mind for 3 years, a name that belonged to a signals officer who had retired 8 months ago and had, in his retirement, taken a position with the Army Inspector General's office as a technical advisor, and he needed to say that name to the right person at the right moment, and the moment had arrived. He dialed. The line rang twice, picked up. "It's Merritt," he said. "I need you to pull the Kandahar Ridge relay logs. All of them. Full transcript." He paused. "And I need them filed with the state board in Montana by end of business today." The voice on the other end said something. "Yes," Caleb said. "Today. I'll explain later." Another pause, longer, because the woman who saved my life is about to have her license pulled by a man who has never done anything right in his career, and I'm not going to let that happen from a hospital bed. He ended the call. He put the phone down on the bed beside him. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then he looked at his left foot, and he moved it slowly. With effort, the sensation still muted and strange and present, and he kept looking at it till the morning nurse came back in with his post-surgical medication and told him, with the careful authority of someone who had been a nurse for 20 years and did not entertain arguments on this point, that he needed to rest. "In a few minutes," he said, but his eyes stayed open. He needed to rest. He didn't. Caleb Merritt lay in the recovery bed at Carver General with the phone on the blanket beside him and stared at the acoustic tile ceiling and thought about the particular kind of helplessness that came not from physical injury but from distance, from sitting 47 miles away from something important while your body was not yet in a condition to close that distance. He had operated in worse states. He had called in coordinates with a dislocated shoulder and provided witness testimony while still carrying shrapnel. Distance was manageable. Distance was a logistics problem. He moved his left foot again. The sensation had shifted overnight from muted through a wall to something he could only describe as muted through a screen. Still not full, still not what it should be, but closer. Physical therapist, who had come in at 7, had been carefully optimistic in the way that medical professionals were carefully optimistic when the picture was genuinely improving. But they did not want to set an expectation that a single bad morning could shatter. He had read that register correctly and found it more reassuring than false confidence would have been. Picked up the phone again and sent a text to Party. "Dale is on site. What's happening with the board filing?" The response came in 90 seconds. "Alt's people are moving. ETA on board submission 3 p.m. Colt filed his complaint at 7 a.m. We're ahead of it, but not by much." Caleb put the phone down. He looked at the window. The sky over Millhaven was the specific blue of Montana after a storm, hard and clean, and very far up, the kind of sky that made everything below it look slightly too small. He thought about Nora in the common room, signing a form with Colt, watching from the doorway. Party had described it to him at 8:15 in the flat-tone Party used for everything. But even through the flatness, Caleb's had heard what it meant. She had signed it. She had let the record open. After 8 years of keeping that door closed, she had picked up the pen. He understood that better than most people would have. At Hartwell, the morning had developed a texture that Roy Hebert later described to his wife as like before a building inspection, except the building had been hiding things for 2 years. Every staff member who had ever written a concern in a personal notebook and decided not to submit it was suddenly finding those notebooks. Every conversation that had quietly in supply closets and break rooms and parking lots about the things. Colt dismissed was finding its way to the surface, the way water found its way through soil after a heavy rain, not as a flood, but as a slow, inevitable emergence. Inspector Dale worked methodically. He had commandeered the small conference room near the administrative wing and was interviewing staff in 20-minute blocks, alone, with his recorder on the table and his notepad open and the door closed. The second man, who turned out to be from the state attorney general's patient advocate division, a detail that had not been in any of Nora's memos because she hadn't known there was such a division, worked separately, reviewing the facility's financial records and fundraising documentation with the focused attention on who had the fetness Nora continued her shift. That was the part that nobody seemed to have expected, not Colt, not Patricia, not the two staff members who kept finding reasons to walk past the nursing station. She had come back from the common room, sat down at her station, opened her shift report, and gone back to work. She had medications to administer. She had wound dressings to change. She had Dwight Foss in room 7, who wanted to tell her about a different dog this time. A German shepherd named Pete, who had lived to 14, and who Dwight had been with when Pete died, and the way he described that the specific quality of quiet in the room, the weight of it was the kind of thing that you sat with, fully, even when the rest of the building was generating a different kind of noise. She sat with it. She was good at that. Dale interviewed her at 1:15. It was the second conversation they had had, but it was different from the morning, more structured, more specific, moving through a timeline that had clearly been built from multiple accounts. He asked about the September memo first, then the October equipment flag, then the November staffing concern. He had the dates in front of him, which meant someone else had corroborated the timeline independently. Who submitted the staffing concern with you? He asked. I submitted it myself. But Marcus Webb had spoken to me the week before about his own attempts to flag the therapy equipment issues. I referenced his concerns in my memo. Did you inform Mr. Webb that you were referencing his concerns? Yes. Did he object? He said, and I'm quoting as closely as I can. I've been trying to get someone to listen for 2 years. So please, yes, use whatever I told you. She paused. That's close to exact, Dale wrote. He asked about the photographs. She told him what Roy had told her, when, in what context. She told him she had 3 patient names she believed had not signed image releases, with the caveat that she had not reviewed the release files herself, and her belief was based on conversations with those patients about their privacy preferences. Dale asked for the names. She gave them. She was aware that giving those names was a significant step, that it moved the investigation from institutional process into specific patient harm, and she gave them anyway, because the alternative was protecting a system that had already decided her documentation was a liability. One more thing, Dale said, near the end of the interview. Director Colt's license complaint. Are you aware that your military service verification was filed with the board at 2:47 this afternoon? She had not known the exact time. I was aware it was being processed. The board reviewed it. The complaint has been suspended pending full review, which, given the verification documentation, is likely to result in dismissal. He paused. I'm telling you this because it's relevant to your employment status and because you should have the information. He looked at her with the neutrality that was not coldness, but was something steadier. For the record, the clinical decisions you made on the night of the 14th are consistent with both your nursing scope and your documented competency level. There's nothing in the incident record that supports the complaint. I know, she said, but thank you. She walked back to her station. She did not allow herself to feel the full weight of the relief yet, because the day was not over, and Colt was still behind his office door, and partial victories had a way of becoming something else if you celebrated them before they were finished. Marcus Webb came to find her at 3:30. He was a compact man, mid-40s, with a physical therapist's build, not large but functionally strong, and the expression of someone who had been holding something tightly for a long time, and had recently been given permission to set it down, which created its own kind of complicated feeling. I just talked to Dale for 40 minutes, he said. Go. I told him everything. The equipment requests. The session documentation they asked me to mark complete when the equipment was still broken. He leaned against the nursing station counter. He asked me about a specific date in October, the resistance bands. I had the original request in my email. I forwarded it to him. Good. Colt's going to know it was me. Colt is going to have significantly larger problems than knowing it was you, she said. It was not reassurance. It was a straightforward assessment of the situation. Webb looked at her for a moment. How are you so calm? She thought about that honestly. I've been in rooms where being calm was the difference between things going right and things going very wrong, she said. came a habit. Must be a useful habit. Sometimes she looked at the time. Go do your afternoon sessions. The residents still need the work. He went. She watched him go with the odd, specific awareness that the facility was full of people who had been doing their jobs under conditions that made doing those jobs harder than they needed to be, and who had, for various reasons, job security, isolation, the particular institutional pressure that Colt was very skilled at applying, stayed quiet about it longer than they should have. She was not angry at them for that. She understood it. She had been quiet about plenty of things in her life, for reasons that felt sufficient at the time and looked different in retrospect. Colt's unraveling was not dramatic. That was the thing nobody, who later described those 3 days at Hartwell, could quite convey how undramatic the actual collapse was, how it happened in increments that were each individually minor and collectively catastrophic. There was no shouting. There was no single confrontation. Paperwork. It was a state inspector requesting the maintenance logs, and findings had been signed off by Colt himself, Stamot, himself as adequate when the vendor records showed the equipment had not been serviced. It was the patient advocacy officer requesting the fundraising files and finding that 11 photographs had been used across 4 external communications without documented releases, and that 2 of those patients had explicitly requested privacy status in their intake forms. It was Sandra Pratt, the HR consultant, who submitted her own memo to the facility board at 4:15 that afternoon. Nora learned this from Patricia, who learned it from Roy, who had a window to the parking lot and had seen Pratt sitting in her car on the phone for 40 minutes before driving away, stating that she had concerns about the internal documentation process and was recusing herself from further involvement in employment matters until the board had reviewed the compliance findings. Sandra Pratt recusing herself was the moment Nora understood that the ground had fully shifted. HR consultants did not recuse themselves from employment matters unless they had concluded that the employment matter was downstream of something larger than employment. The board was notified at 4:45. Nora knew this because Colonel Alt texted her at 4:52. She had not given him her number, but Pardee had, apparently, which was a conversation for another day, with 3 words, "Board is convening." She was changing a dressing on a patient in room 6 when her phone buzzed. She finished the dressing. She thanked the patient, a former Marine named Teresa Quirk, who had been at Hartwell for 6 weeks and was making slow, real progress on a knee replacement recovery and who deserved her full attention. And she stepped into the corridor and read the text. She typed back, "When? Alt, emergency session. Tonight or tomorrow morning. Colt has been asked to step back from operational decisions pending review." She stood in the corridor for a moment. The overhead fluorescent in this section still buzzed at a frequency that had bothered her since September. She had submitted a maintenance request for it in October. It was still buzzing. She put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. Colt left the building at 5:20. Roy watched him go, told Nora about it later, with the economy of a man who didn't embellish and said he had carried a box in his briefcase and had not said anything to anyone he passed in the corridor, which was its own kind of statement. The box was apparently not large, 6 years of directorship, and the physical evidence of it fit in something you could carry with one hand. Nora was not in the building when he left. She had been in the parking lot on the satellite phone, which she had returned to shelf 4B that morning, but had checked out again for this call, talking to Pardee about the relay logs. "They were filed," Pardee said. "Full transcript, time-stamped differentials, the technical report from the hardware fault assessment that was done 3 weeks after Kandahar, but never attached to the original incident review." She stood in the parking lot in the January, cold with the phone against her ear and the sky above Crane Falls going from late afternoon blue to early evening purple at the edges. Her breath made small clouds. She had not put her coat on to come out here. "The hardware fault assessment," she said. "That was done internally by the Signals Core Maintenance Unit. Routine post-deployment equipment audit. The fault was documented. It just never got cross-referenced to the incident report. Party was quiet for a moment. That's not unusual, technically. Two separate administrative systems that don't automatically talk to each other. But someone should have caught the connection during the incident review, and they didn't. Or someone caught it and decided not to look closer. Maybe. I've thought about that. I don't have a definitive answer. Another pause. The relay logs are in the system now. They're part of the official record. Timeline stands corrected. She looked at the mountains. They had the specific quality of mountains at dusk in winter, not diminished by the light, just differently present. The same mass, the same height, seen from a different angle. Spent 8 years, she said, not completing it. I know, Party said. I know you did. She exhaled. Her breath made a cloud, and the cold air took it apart. How's Caleb? Argumentative. Which means he's fine. A hint of something warmer in Party's voice. He's been on the phone most of the afternoon. I told him to rest, and he told me the surgery was on his neck, not his dialing hand. She made a sound that was, this time, actually a brief laugh. Surprised her. I'll call tomorrow, she said. He'll want to hear from you before tomorrow, Party said. But that's your call. She ended the call. She stood in the parking lot for another minute, in the cold she hadn't dressed for, not because she needed to, but because the cold was clarifying in a way that indoor spaces weren't, and she needed that clarity before going back inside. The board met the following morning at 9, not at Hartwell, at the offices of the board's administrative chair in Millhaven, which meant anyone who was going to be there had to drive 47 miles on a road that was clear but still carrying the memory of the storm in its edges. Nora drove herself in her own car, which was a decade-old sedan with adequate snow tires and a heater that worked only on the passenger side, which she had adapted to by keeping a blanket in the back seat. The meeting was not a hearing. It was not structured with advocates or formal positions. It was 7 board members. Inspector Dale, the patient advocacy officer, Sandra Pratt, who had arrived, looking like someone who had not slept, and Nora, who had. Colt was not there. The board chair, a woman named Doctor. Lillian Baxter, who had the compact authority of someone who ran a pediatric practice and spent her volunteer hours in governance roles because she believed organizations required people who actually understood healthcare to make decisions about it open by. Stating that the board had reviewed Dale's preliminary findings, the patient advocacy officer's report on the image authorization issue, and the documentation submitted by Nora over the previous 8 months. We have some questions, she said, and I want to be direct about the purpose of this meeting. It's not to adjudicate blame. We're here to understand what happened and what it means for how this facility operates going forward. She was direct. That was what Nora remembered later about Lillian Baxter, that she had no interest in the performance of authority and moved immediately to the substance of things, which was a specific and uncommon quality in anyone who ran meetings. Questions ran for 2 hours. Nora answered them the same way she answered everything sequentially, specifically without editorializing. When she didn't know something, she said so. When she had a clinical opinion about something, she distinguished it from documented fact. She brought the original copies of her memos, her requisitions, her shift notes, and her personal documentation log, and she laid them on the table in front of the board members and let them read what they needed to read. Dale presented his preliminary findings at 11. Equipment maintenance falsification, 3 instances, documented. Patient image misuse, 11 photographs, 2 with explicit privacy flags violated. Staffing ratio violations, 7 documented incidents over 18 months where night coverage fell below state minimums. Emergency preparedness failures, the defibrillator, the expired medications, the absence of a tested emergency communication protocol, and 1 additional finding that Dale presented with the careful tone he used for the most significant things, which was the finding Nora had not known was coming. We found evidence, Dale said, that on 3 occasions in the past 14 months, patient incident reports were amended after initial submission. The amendments reduced the severity classification of the incidents in the official record. The amendments were made from Director Colt's administrative login. The room was quiet. In each case, Dale continued, the initial report had been filed by a staff nurse and reflected a higher severity classification than the amended version. In 2 of the 3 cases, the initial filing was consistent with state reporting requirements that would have triggered mandatory external review. He paused. The amended versions did not. Dr. Baxter looked at the table for a moment, then at Dale. So those incidents were never externally reviewed. Correct. She looked at Nora. Were you aware of this? I was not aware of the amendments. I was aware that 2 incident reports I had flagged as high severity had not generated the external review I expected them to generate. I attributed that to process delay. She paused. I should have pushed harder. You had no way of knowing the reports had been amended, Dale said. It was not softening. It was precision. No. But I noticed the pattern. I didn't trace it to its source. She looked at Baxter. I filed memos. I should have escalated outside the facility. Baxter held her gaze. Why didn't you? Nora took a moment with that. Because I was trying to fix it from inside first. And because she stopped. Honest. Because I had my own reasons for not wanting to attract formal attention to my background. That affected my judgment about how hard to push. The room was quiet again, but a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of shock. The quiet of people revising their picture of a situation. I understand that, Baxter said. And the way she said it communicated that she actually did. The board voted at 2 in the afternoon. Nora was not in the room for the vote. She was in the corridor outside, on the orange vinyl chair that was apparently a design standard for waiting areas throughout the entire Montana healthcare system, and she drank coffee that was marginally better than the Carver General variety, and watched the snow on the parking lot begin to melt in the thin winter sun. Party had texted her at noon, Caleb is being moved to the rehab unit. First PT session this afternoon. She had texted back, good. He had sent a photo. She hadn't expected that. It was Caleb in the rehab bed, giving the camera a look that was not quite a smile, more like the expression of a person who was aware that smiling at the camera, while in a hospital gown, was a choice they were declining to make. And beside the bed was a physical therapist with a resistance band, and Caleb's left foot was off the bed, elevated, not by much, but off the bed. She looked at the photo for a long time. The board door opened at 2:18. Dr. Baxter came out first, which Nora read correctly as a choice about the order of information delivery. We voted to remove Director Colt, effective immediately, Baxter said. We're terminating his employment contract and referring the incident report amendments to the state AG for further review. The image authorization violations will be addressed directly with the affected patients, with formal apology letters and an offer of whatever remediation they consider appropriate. Nora nodded. We're also commissioning an independent review of the 3 incidents whose severity classifications were changed. Baxter paused. The original classifications were correct. There are patients who may not have received follow-up care they were entitled to. We need to know that. Yes, Nora said. You do. We're requiring the facility to develop and implement a full emergency preparedness plan within 60 days. We're bringing in an external medical director on an interim basis while we conduct a proper search. Baxter looked at her with the evaluating expression of someone who had made a decision and was about to say it. We'd like to offer you an interim clinical lead position while that process is underway. Nora looked at her. You'd have authority over clinical staffing decisions, emergency protocol development, and patient care standards. You'd report directly to the board, not to any interim administrative structure. What does that mean in practical terms? It means if you see a problem, you don't write a memo. Baxter was direct. You fix it, and if someone tries to stop you, they answer to us. Nora sat with that for a moment. She thought about 8 months of memos. She thought about sitting in Colt's office while he told her to stay in her lane. She thought about Caleb on the floor, and the satellite phone, and the helicopter tilting in the crosswind, and the wooden panel from the supply closet shelf. I have conditions, she said. Baxter looked at her without surprise. Tell me, minimum staffing ratios are non-negotiable on every shift. Can't meet them, we reduce census until we can. Mandatory trauma de-escalation training for every staff member before the end of March. Emergency equipment on a monthly verification schedule with an external auditor, not an internal one. She paused. And the veteran privacy policy is rewritten from scratch with patient input before any external communications go out again. Baxter looked at her for a long moment. That's going to be expensive. Cheaper than the alternative, Nora said, which is what you just spent the last 2 days looking at. Baxter was quiet for a moment. Then, she said, we'll need to discuss the specifics. But those conditions are not unreasonable. She extended her hand. Are you willing to have that conversation? Nora shook her hand. Her hand was steady. So was Baxter's. Yes, Nora said. I am. She walked back to the car. The parking lot was not fully clear. There were still icy patches at the edges, places the maintenance truck hadn't reached. And she navigated around them with the practiced attention of someone who had learned that the middle of a cleared path was not always where the middle appeared to be. She got in the car. She turned on the heat. Only the passenger side, as always. She sat there for a moment before starting the engine, took out her phone, and opened Party's photo again. Caleb's foot off the bed. Not by much. Enough. She typed, tell him his PT needs to be relentless. Not comfortable. Relentless. Party's response came in 30 seconds. He says he doesn't take PT direction from a nurse. She typed, tell him I'm not just a nurse. 3 dots. Then he says he knows. He says that's the point. She put the phone in her pocket. She started the car. The heater came on passenger side only. Warm and slightly insufficient. And she drove out of the parking lot onto the Millhaven Road, back toward Crane Falls, 47 miles of cleared highway with icy edges, the mountains to the west, catching the afternoon light. She was 2 miles out of Millhaven when her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She didn't check it. She didn't check her phone while driving, a discipline she maintained in the same category as several other disciplines that were unglamorous and non-negotiable. She let it buzz. It buzzed again. Then a third time. She pulled over at a wide shoulder where the road bent west and picked it up. 3 messages. First from Party, you need to call me. Second, 30 seconds later, now. Third, 2 minutes after that, from an unknown number that resolved, when she looked at it, to a Washington area code she didn't recognize. Ms. Vance, this is Captain Ferris. There's something in the Kandahar relay logs we didn't flag this morning because we didn't have the full context. Colonel Alt has reviewed it. We needed to speak with you. Please call when you see this. She looked at the 3 messages. She looked at the highway ahead, the road to Crane Falls, the mountains, called Pardee. He picked up on the first ring, skipped the opening. The relay logs, he said. When Ferris's people filed them with the board, they ran a full cross-reference against the original incident file. The file we saw the partial declassification, it was incomplete. What do you mean incomplete? There was a second transmission, Pardee said, after yours. 12 minutes after the Kandahar abort order. His voice was controlled in the way that he controlled things when he was not entirely controlled underneath. From a senior officer's position. Countermanding the abort. Nora went very still. The 3 men who died, Pardee said. They received 2 orders, yours, telling them to withdraw. And 12 minutes later, another order telling them the abort had been rescinded and to hold position. The road ahead was very clear and very straight. She looked at it without seeing it. Who? She said. The transmission identifier is in the log. It takes some parsing to read the full chain. But Ferris's people got there. Pardee paused. The officer who sent the countermand order retired in 2019. His name is in the file, Pardee. It's Alt, Pardee said. Countermand came from Raymond Alt. The road was straight and empty, and the mountains to the west were catching the last of the afternoon light, and Nora sat in her car on the shoulder with the phone against her ear and the heater running on the passenger side and said nothing for a long moment. Pardee, let her have the moment. That was something she had come to understand about Joel Pardee in the last 36 hours. He was a man who understood the value of not filling silence. Say that again, she said finally. Not because she hadn't heard it, because she needed to hear it a second time with the first shock already absorbed so she could actually process the structure of what he was telling her. He said it again. The second transmission, 12 minutes after her abort order. The countermand. The three men who had received two orders, one telling them to withdraw and one telling them the withdrawal had been canceled. Transmission identifier, the name at the end of it. Raymond Alt. He came to the facility, she said. This morning. Yes. He sat across from me. He told me the commendation was mine. He handed me a form. She stopped. He spent the whole conversation positioning himself, as someone who had been trying to make things right. I know. And all of it, the records release, the board filing, getting Colt's complaint suspended, all of that was real. Or was it? It was real, Pardee said, and he said it with the certainty of someone who had already worked through that question. Getting your record verified, pushing back on Colt, that part was genuinely what he said it was. I don't think he came there to obstruct. I think he came there because Caleb found you and the whole situation was moving, and he wanted to be in front of it. A pause. Or behind it. In a position where he looked like the person helping rather than the person with something to answer for. Nora looked at the dashboard. The temperature gauge sat exactly where it always sat. Everything in the car functioning exactly as expected. She had the disorienting sensation of a situation in which the surface was perfectly ordinary and the ground underneath it had just shifted by a significant degree. Does Alt know that Ferris found it? She asked. Ferris works for Alt. Or, worked for him, the reporting relationship is indirect. But the short answer is, we don't know yet whether Alt has seen the full cross-reference. How long before he does? If he checks in with Ferris hours. Maybe less. She looked at the highway. The road to Crane Falls was 45 more minutes. The road back to Millhaven was 2 miles behind her. She sat with those two directions for about 10 seconds. Who else has the full log? She said. Ferris filed it with the state board as documentation for your service verification, which means it's in a state system. It's not going anywhere. Pardee's voice was careful. But the significance of the second transmission, whether anyone at the board level has the context to understand what they're looking at, that's a different question. I need to call Ferris. I know. He's waiting. She ended the call. She sat for 3 more seconds. Then she dialed the Washington number. Ferris picked up immediately. He sounded like a man who had spent the last hour in a state of controlled but genuine alarm. His voice had the quality of someone maintaining composure through focus rather than ease. Ms. Vance, he said, walk me through exactly what you found and when. He did. The cross-reference had been a routine part of the filing process standard procedure when classified service records were being submitted alongside declassified supporting documentation to ensure consistency between the two sets of timestamps. The analyst running the cross-reference had flagged the second transmission because its timestamp placed it within the operational window, and it originated from a senior officer position that should not have had communication authority at that stage of the mission. The analyst had brought it to Ferris at 1:40. Ferris had reviewed the full chain at 2:15. He had called Pardee at 2:50 after confirming the transmission identifier traced definitively to Alt's position on this night of the Kandahar operation. Does Colonel Alt know you found it? She asked. A pause that was not long enough to be evasion, but was long enough to be honest. I haven't reported it to him directly. The colonel is not my direct CO. I'm on temporary assignment from a separate division. But I have an obligation to report significant findings up my chain, and my chain and his chain intersect at a certain level. Another pause. I wanted to speak to you first. Why? Because you are the person this information most directly affects, Ferris said. And because with respect, I didn't think it was right for you to find out from a chain of command briefing that didn't include you. She took a breath. What are the options? The transmission log is already filed with the state board as part of your surface record documentation. It's in the system. Nothing I do now removes it from the state's system. He was careful and precise. But whether anyone at the Army level formally investigates the countermand order is a separate process. That would require an official inquiry, which would require someone with standing to request it. Caleb has standing, she said. Yes. And you could submit a flag through your chain. Yes. That would move it into formal Army channels. It would not be fast. These things take months, but it would be official, and it would be documented, and it would go somewhere. He was quiet. I'm prepared to do that. I wanted your input first. She thought about Raymond Alt, sitting in the common room of Hartwell Veterans Recovery Center, with his hands folded on his knees and his careful, measured voice telling her that the commendation had been sitting in a file waiting for her, that the three men's families had been told the corrected timeline, that he had spent years trying to find her. All of that was likely true, and none of it had included the fact that 12 minutes after her correct, timely, properly authorized abort order, he had sent a countermand that put those men back in the blast zone. She didn't know why. She probably never would know all of why. People made decisions in combat under conditions that could not be fully reconstructed from a timestamp and a transmission identifier. Maybe he had new intelligence. Maybe he had made a miscalculation. Maybe he had been wrong and had spent 7 years building an architecture of partial reparation around that wrongness without ever naming it directly. She would never know. That was a thing she had to accept. What she knew was what the log showed. What she knew was what had happened. File the flag, she said. Yes, ma'am, Ferris said. Ended the call. She put the phone on the passenger seat. She looked at the mountains for a long moment. The light had shifted while she was on the calls, moving from afternoon gold to something cooler and more diffuse, and then she started the car and pulled back onto the highway. Not toward Millhaven, toward Crane Falls, because the road forward was the only one that made sense. Called Caleb from the road. She used the Bluetooth, which she rarely used, and his voice came through the car's speakers with the slight echo of a hospital room. Pardee told me, he said before she could start. Then you know what the log shows. Yeah. A pause. The particular quality of a long exhale. I didn't know about the countermand. None of us knew. The version Alt told us the corrected timeline. The hardware fault that was real, as far as it went. He just never went far enough. He helped expose my service record today. He got the board complaint suspended. I know that too. Caleb's voice was level. I've been lying here for 2 hours thinking about it. A man can do a true thing and an incomplete thing at the same time. It doesn't make the incomplete part disappear. No, she said. It doesn't. What are you going to do? She was quiet for a moment. Ferris is filing an official flag. The log is already in the state system. As part of my documentation, it's not going anywhere. The Army will investigate on their timeline, which will be long and bureaucratic and will probably not produce a dramatic outcome. But it will be in the record. Alt's record. Yes. Caleb was quiet. She could hear something in the background, the soft mechanical sounds of a hospital room, a monitor, a distant voice. The ordinary sounds of a place where people were recovering. 3 men, he said. Their families deserved the full picture, not the partial one. I know. I'll make sure they get it. He said it the way he said things, not with ceremony, just as a statement of what was going to happen. Whenever the investigation moves, I'll be in contact with the families. They deserve to know that the order that was supposed to bring their people home was the right call, and that someone else made a different one. 12 minutes later, she looked at the road ahead. It won't bring them back. No, nothing does that. A pause. But it changes what the record says. For those families, that matters. I know it would matter to me. She drove in silence for a moment. Then she said, How's the foot? PT is sadistic. Good. You told Pardee to tell them to be relentless. I did. That's, yeah, a short, rough sound that was Caleb Merritt's version of a laugh, I figured. Keep moving it, she said, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Copy that. Sparrow Two. She let that sit. The call sign that she had spent 8 years treating like a door she had locked from the outside. "Nora," she said. "You can call me Nora." A brief pause. "Copy that, Nora." She smiled at the road. It was small and not performed, and gone in a few seconds, but it was real. She got back to Crane Falls at 5:47. The facility was in the quiet of early evening, that particular institutional hour when the day's activity has settled and the night shift hasn't yet come to full awareness. Patricia was finishing her end-of-shift documentation at the nursing station and looked up when Nora came in. "How'd it go?" Patricia asked. "Colt's been removed. The board's convened an emergency session. There's an interim structure going into place." Nora put her bag behind the station. "There's going to be a lot of work in the next few weeks." Patricia absorbed this. "Are you staying?" Nora looked down the corridor, the east wing, the common room, the framed photographs that were coming off the walls, the physical therapy room where the resistance bands had been replaced. Finally, 3 days ago, room 14, where the radiator still needed a cover, and she had written that on a new list she was keeping. Her own list, not a memo filed into a system that redirected it into silence, but an actual working list that she was going to address item by item. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." Patricia nodded. She looked back at her documentation, then back up. "For what it's worth that night with the helicopter, I was scared. I froze up for a minute in that room." "I know. And you didn't make me feel worse about it. You just told me what to do." Patricia looked at the desk. "I wanted to say that. I should have said it sooner." "You held the flashlight at the right angle for 11 minutes, Nora said. "It wasn't nothing." Patricia looked up. Something in her expression shifted, not gratitude exactly, more like recognition, kind that went both directions. Nora, late that night, not because she had to her shift technically ended, because there was work that needed doing, and she was the person who understood its shape. She walked every corridor and wrote her list. The radiator cover in room 14, the buzzing fluorescent in the east wing, third panel from the supply room, the emergency communication board, which needed to be updated with current protocols and current calls and current numbers, and laminated and mounted at eye level rather than at the upper corner of the wall where it currently lived, which required you to tilt your head back to read it. The IV supply in the storage room, which was adequately stocked for the moment but needed a rotation system. So the oldest stock was always used first. She wrote it all down, 22 items. By the time she reached the end of the west corridor, Roy found her there at 8:15. He was still in the facility for reasons she did not ask about, because Roy Hebert had his own relationship with this place, and his own reasons for staying late, and she respected both. 22 things, he said, looking at her list over her shoulder. 23. I forgot the drain in the therapy room. He looked at the list for a moment. You're going to fix all of these, most of them this week, the others on a schedule. He was quiet for a moment. Roy was a man of very few words, and the ones he used tended to matter. When Colt was first hired, he said he came in with a binder, a whole operations binder. He walked up every corridor the first week, wrote things down. He looked at the corridor ahead of them. 3 months later, he was writing different kinds of things down. I know, she said. That binder is in his office. The real one, from the first week. Roy paused. I kept it. Figured it might matter someday. He looked at her sideways. You want it? She looked at him. Why did you keep it? He thought about it. Because it was honest, he said. He was right about most of it. He just stopped caring about being right. He shrugged the particular shrug of a man who had watched institutional decay unfold over years and had not had the power to stop it, but had preserved what he could against the possibility that someone else eventually would. You're going to care about being right. It was not quite a question. I'm going to try, she said. I won't always succeed. He nodded, like that was the correct answer. I'll get you the binder. The formal outcomes moved on the timelines that formal outcomes moved on, which were slower than anyone involved would have preferred and faster than Nora had feared. Harlan Colt's employment was officially terminated by board resolution 12 days after his removal from operational duties. The State G reviewed the incident report amendments and determined that 2 of the 3 amended reports constituted deliberate misclassification in violation of state healthcare reporting law. Colt's professional license came under review. The process was ongoing and would be for some time, but the findings were documented and formal and public in the way that state compliance records were public, available to anyone who knew where to look, permanent in the record, not something that could be quietly absorbed and forgotten. The 11 photographs were removed from every fundraising communication, every printed material, every digital archive, accessible to the public. 3 patients were contacted directly by Dr. Baxter in writing, with a formal apology that had been written and rewritten until it said what it needed to say without hedging. 2 of those patients responded. 1 did not. All 3 were offered an independent patient advocate for the duration of their stay at no cost, which was the minimum that was owed, and everyone involved knew it. The independent review of the 2 reclassified incident reports took 6 weeks. In one case, the original high-severity classification had been correct, and the patient involved, who had since discharged, was contacted and offered a follow-up consultation with a specialist. In the other case, the reclassification had not materially altered the care received, but the documentation itself was corrected in the official record. Clean and accurate was the minimum standard. The board voted to hold itself to it. Marcus Webb got the new equipment he had been requesting for 2 years. He said nothing dramatic about it. He just started using it in sessions, and the quality of the work improved in the way that work improved when the tools matched the task, which was not dramatic either, but was real in every session it affected. Dwight Foss finished telling Nora about every dog he had ever owned over the course of 4 Tuesday afternoons. There had been 6 dogs total, spanning 53 years. The last one, a beagle named Clarence, had been his wife's dog originally, and Dwight had been skeptical of Clarence for the first year and devoted to him for the following 8. Cried a little when he got to the end of that one. Nora sat with it. She was still good at that. The Army investigation into the Kandahar Ridge countermand order was initiated through formal channels 41 days after Ferris filed his flag. It was not publicized. It did not generate news coverage. It moved through the specific machinery of military administrative inquiry at the pace that machinery moved, which was not fast. Raymond Alt was notified that he was the subject of a formal review. He retained a military attorney. He did not contact Nora. She did not expect him to. She thought about him occasionally in the way you thought about things that didn't have clean resolutions, not obsessively, not with the grinding quality that the Kandahar timeline had occupied for 8 years, but with the honest complexity of someone who had been helped by a person who had also caused harm and who had decided that both of those things could be true simultaneously, and that she did not need to flatten the contradiction into something simpler in order to live with it. He had found her. He had gotten her record verified. He had helped shift the board complaint before it could damage her license. Those things had happened, and they had mattered. He had also sent a countermand order on a night in 2017, and 3 people had died in the gap between her order and his. And that had happened too, and the families of those 3 people were now in contact with Caleb and with Pardee and were receiving, through a process that was slow and imperfect, and theirs to navigate at their own pace, the full picture of what the record actually showed. She could not control what they did with it. She could only ensure that they had it. That, she had come to understand, was enough. Not comfortable. Not resolved in the way you wanted things resolved, where someone said precisely and proportionately, and you could point at the outcome and say, there, justice, exact and complete. But enough. Real. The kind of enough that you could build a next day on. Caleb walked into Hartwell on a Tuesday in late March. He came through the front entrance without a cane. He was not moving at his pre-injury pace. His gait had a deliberateness to it, a slight extra attention to each step, the mark of someone who had spent 12 weeks relearning something that most people took for granted and was now in the process of making it fluent again. He would probably always have some version of that deliberateness. His PT had told him so, and he had received that information the way he received most information he didn't want, which was by arguing briefly and then accepting it as a parameter to work within. He stopped at the nurse's station. Was used racing. Roy was in the corridor, folded, and the expression of a man who had seen a lot of recoveries and had learned to recognize the real ones. Nora looked up from the chart she was reviewing. She looked at him at the way he was standing, weight distributed, both feet on the floor, and then she looked at his face. "Both feet," she said. "Both feet," he confirmed. He extended his right hand across the station counter. She looked at it for a moment, then stood and shook it. His grip was firm. Her grip was firm. Neither of them made a speech about it, which was exactly right. "How's the sensation?" she asked. 90% on the right, maybe 85 on the left. The PT says that's probably where it stays. He paused. "I'll take it." "You should." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "Party told me about Alt. The investigation. It's moving." He looked at the counter, then back up. "I've been in contact with the families. All three. He stopped. This was the part that was not easy to talk about, and he wasn't going to make it easy by using words that weren't precise. It's hard. It doesn't fix things. But they know now. The full sequence. He looked at her directly. "They know you gave the right order." She held his gaze. She did not look away, and she did not look down, and she did not say anything for a moment, because the thing else required a moment to sit in before she could trust herself to respond to it without the response being too large or too small. "Eskunumin, thank you," she said, quietly. "You don't have to thank me for the truth," he said. The truth was always there. We just had to get it out of the filing system. Patricia, who had been at the station the entire time and had been making an admirable effort to seem focused on something else, gave up the effort and looked between the two of them with undisguised interest. Caleb noticed. "Colleague of yours?" he said to Nora. "Patricia," Nora said. She held a flashlight at the right angle for 11 minutes on the worst night of your life. You should know that. Caleb turned to Patricia and extended his hand. Patricia looked slightly startled and then shook it. "Thank you," he said simply. Patricia said, "You're welcome," in the tone of someone saying it for the first time, about something that actually warranted it. He stayed for an hour. He walked the East Corridor with her, which she was doing anyway, on her morning rounds, and she showed him the 23 items from her list, the ones that were done, the ones in progress, the radiator cover in room 14, which had been installed 8 days ago, and which she showed him with the same absence of ceremony that characterized every other item on the list. It was done. It needed to be done. Now it was. He told her about the rehabilitation. 12 weeks of it in a facility outside Millhaven that had nothing to do with veterans' care specifically, but that had a very good spinal program and a physical therapist named Gordon who, true to the description she had sent Party, was relentless in exactly the right way. He told her about the morning 6 weeks in, when he had woken up and both feet had felt fully present, not through a screen or a wall or at a distance, present, and had lain in the dark for several minutes, not doing anything about it, because the feeling was too important to rush. She listened to that without interrupting. It was the kind of detail that mattered. In the therapy room, Marcus Webb was working with a patient on balance exercises with the new equipment, and Caleb stopped out in the doorway and watched for a moment without going in, because interrupting a therapy session for a social call was not something either of them would have been comfortable doing. He watched the session with the expression of someone seeing something that looked like what it was supposed to look like, which was different from what they had walked away from when they had needed to walk away from somewhere. "This is better," he said. "It's getting there," Nora said. "It's not finished." "Nothing good is," he said. "Doesn't mean it's not better." She thought about that. Fair. They were at the end of the East Corridor, near the window that looked out at the parking lot where the helicopter had landed. The lot was clear now, no snow, just pavement and the residual stain of winter, the kind of gray-brown that parking lots got in early spring before the first real rain came through and cleaned them. The mountains to the west still had snow at the peaks, the permanent kind that didn't melt. That was just a feature of the landscape and not a weather event. What happens next? He asked. For you. She looked at the mountains for a moment. There's a veteran who came in last week, 28 years old, Marine, 2 deployments. She's not sleeping and she's not eating right, and she spends 4 hours a day in her room doing nothing that anyone can identify, and everyone who has tried to talk to her has bounced off. She paused. I haven't tried yet. I'm waiting for the right moment. Caleb looked at her sideways. How do you know when it's the right moment? You hear it, she said, in the room. Something shifts. She thought about room 14 at 6:43 in the morning. Caleb's hands raised in a shooter's grip, the specific quality of silence, but before she had said his name. Can't manufacture it. You just have to be there when it happens. He nodded. He understood that. They walked back to the main entrance. At the door, he stopped and looked at her with the expression she had first seen on the floor of this building. Like she existed in 2 categories simultaneously, and then it resolved into something simpler. Not simpler as in less, but simpler as in clearer. You stopped hiding, he said. She considered that. I stopped pretending. The hiding was protecting anyone. He looked at her for a moment. Took you long enough. He smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. Not the controlled, not quite version, but the real one, slightly asymmetric and not performing anything. He turned and walked out through the door, across the parking lot, both feet on the pavement. Toward the car, Party had driven him in and was leaning against across the lot, with his arms folded, and the expression of someone who had decided that this particular moment did not require him to say anything. Nora stood at the door and watched until they drove out of the lot and onto the Crane Falls Road. She wore her blue scrubs the next morning. And the morning after that, she had worn blue scrubs every day for 8 months quietly with her head down. And she wore them now differently, not as a disguise or a way of occupying minimal space, but as the thing they were, the uniform of the work she had chosen. The work she was good at, the work she was going to keep doing. The 28-year-old Marine came to the nursing station at 7:15 on a Thursday, which was not a time anyone had come to the station for a non-urgent matter. She stood at the counter, looking like someone who had made a decision to do something and was in the process of regretting the decision, but was going to do it anyway. I'm not sleeping, she said. I know, Nora said. How do you know? Because I've walked past your room at 2 a.m. twice this week, and your light is on. The young woman, her name was Dana Crew, and she had a crew cut growing out unevenly and a scar below her left ear that she had not explained to anyone, yet looked at her. Is that a privacy violation? I'm on shift. I'm monitoring the corridor. The light under your door is observable from the corridor. Dana thought about that. Okay, Nora said. A pause. What do I do about it? Nora looked at her steadily. Sit down and tell me what's happening when you try to sleep. That could take a while. I have until 9, Nora said. She moved to the small consultation area adjacent to the station, 2 chairs, a table, nothing that looked like a clinical setting, but which was intentional. She sat down. She looked at Dana and waited. Dana sat down. She did not immediately speak. She looked at the table. She was the kind of person who would not start talking until she had decided that the person across from her was actually going to listen, not just respond. And Nora understood that because she was that person herself. She waited. Dana started talking at 7:22. She was still talking at 8:49, and Nora listened to every word. This is the thing that nobody tells you about the women who carry too much for too long. They do not break under the weight. They learn the shape of it. They learn how to move with it, how to function alongside it, how to be useful and present and skilled while carrying something that other people cannot see. Breaking, when it comes, is not dramatic. It is the quiet moment when you finally set the weight down, not because someone made you, not because you were forced to, but because you decided, for the first time, that you were allowed to. Nora Vance had spent 8 years carrying a 4-minute margin that was not hers to carry. She had built a life around it anyway. She had become, inside that life, exactly the kind of person who could stabilize a man's spine on a linoleum floor in the middle of a Montana winter, with a wooden shelf panel and some rolled towels and 2 aides who had never been trained for any of it. She had become the person who stayed calm in the helicopter and answered Dale's questions precisely and signed the form with Colt, watching from the doorway, and told Ferris to file the flag and drove back to Crane Falls on a clear road with ice at the edges and showed up the next morning in her blue scrubs and started the list. She had not needed to become a different person. She had needed to stop pretending she was less than the one she already was. That was the thing about being dismissed, about being told you were too small, too unqualified, too contract, too quiet, too much of whatever the person doing the dismissing needed you to be so that they didn't have to reckon with what you actually were. It did not make you smaller. It made you very good at surviving in confined spaces. And when the space finally opened, when the situation demanded that you take up exactly as much room as your actual capability required, the size was already there. It had always been there. You had just been told, for long enough, not to use it. Kept her list. She worked through it, item by item. She hired a retired Army flight medic named Donna Rush to develop and run a mandatory trauma response training program for every Hartwell staff member. And Donna was not gentle about it, which was correct. She rewrote the veteran privacy policy from scratch with input from 12 current residents, including Dwight Foss, who had opinions about it that were specific, and useful, and who she thanked by name in the document's acknowledgement section, which made him cry a little and then pretend he hadn't. The 23 items became 31, and then, as more was revealed in the process of fixing what was broken, 47. Stopped counting. You stopped counting when the list became the work rather than the evidence that work needed doing. Dana Crew started sleeping by week 3. Not through the night, not yet, but in stretches. Real stretches, with depth to them. She told Nora about it on a Tuesday morning at the station, with the slightly embarrassed process told one reporting progress, they said told themselves they didn't care about and had discovered they cared about very much. Nora told her that was hard won, and she should be proud of it. Dana said, I hate how hard it was. I know, Nora said. Do it anyway. Dana looked at her. Did you? Whatever yours was. A moment. Still doing it, Nora said. That's what it looks like. Dana looked at her for a moment longer. Then she nodded, and that nod had the quality of something actually received. Not just processed and filed away, but taken in. And it was the kind of moment that you did not manufacture and could not repeat, but that was part of why the work was worth doing, and always had been. The mountains outside Hartwell Veterans Recovery Center stood exactly where they had always stood, west-facing, permanent, covered at the peaks with snow that did not melt. They were not interested in who worked in the building below them. They were not moved by institutional decisions, or board votes, or state compliance reviews, or the particular quality of a moment between a nurse and a patient on a Tuesday morning. But they were there. And Nora Vance, in her blue scrubs, at her station, with her list and her work and her finally unclosed door, was there too. She no longer described her past as something that had ruined her. She described it, on the rare occasions she described it at all, as the experience that had built her imperfectly, unevenly, with considerable collateral damage, into exactly the person that room had needed on the worst night of January. She had been dismissed. She had been pushed to the edge of the room and told to stay there. She had stayed quiet long enough to understand the terrain, and then she had spoken, not with performance, not with the particular performance of people who want recognition before they do the work, but with the simple authority of someone who knew what the situation required and was willing to provide it, regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. The acknowledgement came eventually. It usually did for the people who did not need it to come first. She had not needed to become someone new. She had only needed to stop apologizing for the person she had already earned the right to be.